Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. The Majestic Theater has been closed for 15 years, but the marquee still advertises the last film it ever showed. A romantic comedy from 2009 whose title has faded to illegible smears of plastic letters hanging at odd angles. I remember watching that movie here during its final week, sitting in the worn velvet seats that had hosted 3 generations of movie-goers, breathing air that smelled of popcorn and dreams, and the particular mustiness that comes from decades of shared anticipation in dark spaces. Tonight, I'm not supposed to be here. The building was supposed to be demolished last month, but permits got tangled in red tape, environmental concerns, and the sort of bureaucratic delays that keep dead buildings shambling along like zombies. I work for the demolition company, and I'm here to do one final walkthrough, checking for anything valuable or hazardous before the wrecking ball arrives next week. My flashlight cuts through the darkness of the lobby, illuminating the concession stand where I used to buy overpriced candy and sodas. The poster cases that still hold sun, faded advertisements for movies I barely remember. The air is thick with dust and the lingering scent of old carpet, but underneath it all, I can still detect that distinctive movie theater smell, butter, substitute, and industrial disinfectant, and the accumulated excitement of thousands of Saturday nights. The main theater is larger than I remember, my footsteps echoing off walls that stretch up into darkness above my flashlight beam. The seats are arranged in gentle curves facing a screen that looks like a massive gray tooth in the gloom. Some of the seats have been vandalized over the years, their stuffing pulled out and scattered across the sloped floor, but most remain intact, as if they're still waiting for the next show to begin. I make my way down the aisle, checking each row for anything the salvage crew might have missed. In the 3rd row from the front, I find someone's lost earring, a small gold hoop that catches my flashlight beam like a tiny eye. In the 7th row, there's a child's toy truck, its red paint faded to rust brown. Small artifacts of lives briefly intersecting with this place, now abandoned and forgotten. But it's when I reach the front row and turn back to survey the theater that I see something that makes my breath catch in my throat. The screen isn't blank anymore. Instead, it shows what looks like the interior of a movie theater, this movie theater, but somehow different. The seats are fuller, occupied by shadowy figures that seem to shift and blur when I try to focus on them directly. The colors are muted, washed out, as if I'm looking at a very old film or a badly degraded photograph. And in the center of the image, in the front row where I'm standing now, there's a figure waving at me. I spin around, expecting to find someone else in the theater, but I'm alone. The seats behind me are empty, their faded fabric visible in the sweep of my flashlight. When I turn back to the screen, the figure is still there, still waving, and now I can see that it's wearing clothes similar to mine, dark jacket, jeans, work boots. Hello. I call out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. The sound bounces off the walls and returns to me distorted, as if it's traveled a much greater distance than the dimensions of the theater should allow. The figure on the screen doesn't respond to my voice, but it does seem to hear me. It leans forward in its seat, cupping a hand to its ear in the universal gesture of someone trying to hear better. Then it points to something off-screen, gesturing urgently, as if trying to warn me about something I can't see. I examine the theater more carefully, sweeping my flashlight beam across every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. But there's nothing here except me, and the rows of empty seats, and the impossible image on a screen that should be blank, powered by projection equipment that was disconnected and removed years ago. When I look back at the screen, the scene has changed. Now it shows the theater's lobby, but not as it is now, as it was 15 years ago, during its final week of operation. I can see the concession stand lit up and fully stocked, the poster cases displaying current movies, people in period clothing moving through the space with the casual urgency of a Friday night crowd. And there, standing near the entrance, is the same figure that was waving at me from the front row. Now I can see it more clearly, tall, thin, wearing modern clothes that look out of place among the 2009 fashions surrounding it. It's looking directly at me through the screen, its expression impossible to read, but somehow urgent, desperate. The figure starts walking toward the theater entrance, and instinctively, I head back up the aisle toward the lobby. My footsteps echo in the empty theater, but on the screen, I can see the figure's footsteps making no sound at all in the bustling lobby of 15 years ago. It moves like a ghost among the crowd, unnoticed by the other patrons who pass through it, as if it isn't there. I reach the lobby just as the figure on the screen reaches the theater entrance. We stand facing each other across the impossible barrier between the present and the past, between the living and whatever it is that's trying to communicate with me from inside that faded image. The figure raises its hand and presses it against the screen from the inside, like someone trapped behind glass. I approach the lobby's main entrance and place my palm against the door, trying to mirror its gesture. For a moment, I feel a strange warmth against my hand, as if there's another palm pressing back from the other side. Then the image on the screen changes again. Now it shows the interior of the theater, but from a different angle from the projection booth, looking down at the seats. I can see myself 15 years ago, younger, sitting in the 5th row center during that final week, watching the romantic comedy that would be the Majestic's last movie. But there's something wrong with the memory. In the seat next to my younger self, there's another figure, the same tall, thin person in modern clothes, sitting perfectly still while the movie plays. My younger self doesn't seem to notice it, doesn't react to its presence at all. But occasionally, the figure turns to look at me on the screen, and its face is my face, but older, more tired, marked by experiences I haven't had yet. That's impossible. I whisper to the empty lobby. I was alone that night. I remember being alone. But as I watch the screen, I see other scenes from the theater's past, and in each one, the figure is there. Sometimes it's sitting in the audience during movies from the 1990s, wearing clothes that wouldn't be fashionable for another decade. Sometimes it's standing in the lobby during the theater's grand opening in 1963, looking exactly the same as it does now, while everyone around it wears the fashions of the Kennedy era. The figure has been here since the beginning, watching every movie, witnessing every crowd, present at every moment in the theater's history. And in every scene, it's looking directly at me through the screen, trying to communicate something I can't understand. I walk back into the theater and down the aisle to the front row, positioning myself in the same spot where the figure was sitting in the first image I saw. The screen now shows the lobby again, but it's the current lobby, dark, dusty, abandoned. And there, standing near the entrance with a flashlight in his hand, is me. But I'm also here, in the front row, watching myself on the screen. The figure I was seeing isn't someone else at all, it's me, but displaced somehow, existing simultaneously in the present and in the theater's recorded history, trying to warn myself about something that hasn't happened yet or something that's been happening all along. I wave at my image on the screen, and my image waves back. But there's a delay, a slight disconnect that makes it clear we're not quite synchronized. The me on the screen is a few seconds behind, or perhaps a few seconds ahead, creating a temporal loop that traps both versions of myself in an endless cycle of mutual observation. What are you trying to tell me? I ask the screen, and my image's lips move in response. But the words that come out are different from the ones I spoke. Check the projection booth. I didn't say those words, but somehow my image did. A chill runs down my spine as I realize that the figure on the screen isn't just a reflection, it's an independent version of myself. One with knowledge I don't possess. One that's been trapped in the theater's history and is now trying to guide me toward some crucial understanding. I make my way to the narrow staircase that leads to the projection booth, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me as I climb. The booth is small and cramped, filled with the skeletal remains of equipment that was removed years ago. But in the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old film canisters, I find something that shouldn't be here. It's a logbook, leather-bound and thick with years of entries. The handwriting on the cover is mine. Temporal observations. The Majestic Theater Project. I don't remember writing these words. Don't remember keeping any kind of logbook. But when I open it, every page is filled with my handwriting, documenting observations and experiences I've never had. The entries begin 15 years ago, on the night the theater closed. First temporal displacement occurred during final screening. Became aware of my own presence throughout theater's history. Unable to return to normal timeline. Beginning systematic observation of temporal phenomena. Day 30V. Have confirmed presence in over 200 historical moments within theater. Each appearance corresponds to significant events in building's history. Purpose unclear. Day 100I. Discovered that my displacement is connected to the building's impending demolition. My presence in the past is attempting to prevent something catastrophic from occurring during the destruction. Day 500I. Located temporal anchor point in basement. Physical contact with anchor appears to be only way to resolve displacement and prevent disaster. The entries continue for pages, documenting 5 years of temporal displacement, of existing simultaneously across multiple time periods, of watching the theater's history unfold while being powerless to change it. The final entry is dated today, Day 1, 8/25. Demolition scheduled for next week. Younger self has arrived for final inspection. This is the only opportunity to guide him to the anchor point before the building comes down. If I fail, the temporal displacement will create a paradox that could unravel the local timeline. I close the logbook, my hands shaking. The implications are staggering. I'm reading my own future, learning about experiences I'll have after becoming trapped in the theater's temporal matrix. But if I'm here reading this now, then maybe I can avoid that fate. Maybe I can find the anchor point and prevent the displacement from occurring in the first place. I look back at the screen, which now shows the theater from my current perspective in the projection booth. The figure that is me waves from the lobby, then points downward toward the basement. It mouths words I can't hear, but I understand. Follow me. The basement of the Majestic is accessed through a door behind the concession stand that I hadn't noticed during my earlier walk through. The stairs are wooden and creak ominously under my weight, leading down into a space that feels much older than the theater above. The walls are rough stone, and the air carries the damp, earthy smell of a place that has been undisturbed for decades. In the center of the basement, I find what the logbook referred to as the anchor point, a small metallic object embedded in the floor, about the size of a dinner plate and covered with symbols that don't belong to any language I recognize. It pulses with a faint blue light that seems to respond to my presence, growing brighter as I approach. The screen, and there is a screen here too, though I have no idea how that's possible, shows the same basement. But in it, I can see the temporal figure of myself standing exactly where I'm standing now. It's reaching toward the anchor point, its hand extended, but not quite touching the metallic surface. I understand now. The temporal displacement hasn't happened yet, but it's about to. The figure I've been seeing is my future self, trapped in the building's timeline and trying to warn me not to touch the anchor point. But according to the logbook, touching it is the only way to resolve the displacement that's already occurred. It's a paradox with no clean solution. If I don't touch the anchor point, I'll become displaced across time as my future self has been. If I do touch it, I might prevent the displacement, but also erase the experiences that led me to understand the situation in the first place. The figure on the screen is gesturing frantically now, shaking its head, trying to warn me away from the anchor point. But the logbook said contact was necessary to prevent the demolition disaster. Two versions of myself, separated by time and circumstance, giving me contradictory advice. I kneel beside the anchor point, my hand hovering inches above its pulsing surface. The metal feels warm even without direct contact, and I can sense something vast and complex moving beneath it, machinery or intelligence, or some combination of both, that has been waiting patiently for this moment. On the screen, my future self has given up trying to warn me away. Instead, it nods slowly, as if accepting the inevitable. Then it mouths words I can just barely make out. Remember everything. I place my palm against the anchor point. The basement explodes into light and sound and sensation that goes beyond anything my senses should be able to process. I feel myself scattered across time like seeds on the wind, experiencing simultaneously every moment in the theater's history. I'm in the audience for the grand opening, watching a Jimmy Stewart film, while wearing clothes that feel strange and unfamiliar. I'm witnessing the first teenage couple's awkward first date in the back row during the 1970s. I'm present for every birthday party, every anniversary celebration, every first kiss and heartbreak that has ever occurred within these walls. But I'm also still in the basement, still kneeling beside the anchor point, still existing in my own present moment. The temporal displacement hasn't erased my current self. It has expanded me, made me large enough to contain all of the theater's history, while remaining anchored to my original timeline. And I understand now why this is necessary. The demolition isn't just going to destroy a building. It's going to destroy a repository of human experience, a place where thousands of people have shared emotions and dreams and fears in the dark, without someone to witness and remember and preserve those moments. They'll be lost forever, erased as if they never happened. I'm not trapped in time. I'm expanded across it, made into a living archive of everything the majestic has ever meant to anyone. When the building comes down next week, I'll carry all of those memories with me, ensuring that nothing truly important is ever lost. The screen in the basement goes dark, and the anchor point's blue glow fades to nothing. But I can still see the other versions of myself scattered throughout the theater's history. And I understand that they're not separate entities. They're facets of my expanded consciousness, ensuring that every significant moment is witnessed and preserved. I climb back up to the theater, which looks different now, not abandoned and decrepit, but somehow alive with the accumulated weight of all the experiences it has contained. In every seat, I can see the ghostly impressions of everyone who has ever sat there, all of them existing simultaneously in my expanded awareness. The waving figure on the screen wasn't trying to warn me or trap me. It was trying to show me what I was capable of becoming, not a victim of temporal displacement, but a guardian of temporal memory. Someone who could ensure that the demolition of a building doesn't mean the destruction of everything it has ever meant. As I walk back through the lobby toward the exit, I carry with me the sound of every conversation, every laugh, every sob that has ever echoed in these halls. The Majestic Theater will be demolished next week, but what it represented, the human need to gather in dark spaces and share stories and emotions, will continue to exist as long as I remember it. And I will remember everything. Every movie, every audience, every moment of wonder and fear and joy that has ever flickered to life in the darkness. The theater may die, but its dreams will live forever in the expanded space of my consciousness, waiting to be shared with anyone who still believes in the magic of stories told in the dark. The screen may go blank, but the story never really ends. Story 2. The rain started just as I pulled into the parking lot, heavy drops drumming against my windshield like impatient fingers. The Westfield shopping center had been closed for 3 years now, its windows boarded up with plywood that had weathered to a dull gray. But my job was simple enough: security walkthrough, documentation, basic maintenance check. The city wanted everything assessed before the demolition crew arrived next month. I sat in my car for a moment, listening to the rain intensify. The parking lot stretched out before me, cracked asphalt sprouting weeds through the gaps. A few shopping carts sat scattered like metal skeletons, their wheels frozen with rust. The sound of rain on the mall's metal roof created a hollow, echoing drumbeat that seemed to vibrate through the ground and up into my chest. The key turned easily in the service entrance lock, though the door protested with a groan that seemed to echo far too long in the space beyond. I stepped inside and immediately felt the change in air pressure, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stale air. The main corridor stretched ahead of me, flanked by empty storefronts with their security gates pulled down. My footsteps echoed strangely here, not just the expected single echo, but layers of sound bouncing back at different intervals, creating a rhythm that didn't quite match my walking pace. I paused, and the echoes continued for just a moment too long before fading into silence. The smell hit me, and not the musty odor of abandonment I'd expected, but something else, something sweet and artificial, like cotton candy mixed with that particular scent of childhood birthday parties. It was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to grow stronger as I walked deeper into the mall. Above me, the skylights had been covered with tarps, but they billowed slightly in the wind, creating shifting shadows that my flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. The sound of the rain on the roof was different here, more rhythmic, almost melodic. As I listened more carefully, walking slowly down the main concourse, I began to notice something peculiar about that rhythm. It wasn't random. The drops seemed to fall in patterns, 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 2 slower drops, another pause. Over and over, like a code being tapped out on the ceiling above me. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening. The pattern repeated, consistent and deliberate. That's when I heard the first voice. It was soft, barely audible above the rain, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. A child's voice, singing something I couldn't quite make out. The melody was familiar in that maddening way that songs from childhood can be. You know you've heard it before, but the memory sits just beyond reach. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice echoed back at me, but underneath the echo, I could swear I heard a giggle. Light musical, definitely a child. My hand found the radio on my belt, but when I tried to call it in, nothing happened. Dead air. The display showed full bars, but the static that came through the speaker was wrong somehow, too rhythmic, too patterned. I continued forward, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across empty storefronts. The children's clothing store still had mannequins in the window, small figures in dusty outfits that seemed to track my movement with their painted eyes. The toy store's security gate was partially raised, revealing shelves of abandoned merchandise casting long shadows that looked almost like small figures crouched in hiding. The singing grew clearer as I walked. Multiple voices now, a chorus of children singing in harmony. The words were still indistinct, but the melody was definitely familiar, something from a nursery rhyme, perhaps, or a playground song. The kind of thing children sing during recess, clapping their hands in rhythm. I realized I was clapping my hands too. The thought shocked me. I looked down at my hands, still moving in time with the distant singing, and forced them to stop. But the rhythm remained in my chest. my heart beating in sync with the melody floating through the empty mall. When had I started clapping? I couldn't remember. The food court opened up ahead of me, a vast circular space with tables and chairs, still arranged as if waiting for customers who would never come. The singing was louder here, and I could finally make out some words. Round and round the mulberry bush. The monkey chased the weasel. But that wasn't right. That wasn't how the song went. I knew that song from my own childhood, and the words were different. As I listened more carefully, I realized all the words were slightly wrong, as if remembered imperfectly or changed intentionally. The familiar melody remained, but the lyrics had shifted into something else entirely. Round and round the empty halls, the children chased the shadows. My flashlight flickered, and in the moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw movement in the food court. Small figures darting between tables, playing some sort of game. When the light steadied, there was nothing there but dust and silence, except the singing continued. I traced the sound to its source, the old information booth in the center of the food court. The PA system was still mounted on the ceiling above it. Speakers that had once announced store sales and closing times. They were crackling now with static, and through that static, the children's voices were coming in clearer and clearer. Round and round the shopping mall, we play until the morning. I found myself walking in circles around the information booth, matching the rhythm of the song. My footsteps fell perfectly in time with the melody, and I couldn't seem to break the pattern. Each time I tried to stop, to walk in a straight line toward the exit, my feet carried me back to the circular path. The voices were so clear now that I could distinguish individual children. A girl with a slight lisp who emphasized every S sound. A boy whose voice cracked slightly on the higher notes. Another girl who sang just a fraction behind the beat, creating a haunting echo effect. They were so real, so present, that I found myself looking up at the speakers as if I might see their faces there. The flashlight in my hand was dimming, its beam growing yellow and weak. In the failing light, the empty mall seemed to shift and change around me. The storefronts looked different, brighter somehow, as if lit from within. I could smell popcorn and cookies, hear the distant sounds of a crowd, the electronic beeps and chimes of arcade games. Round and round will always play, until the lights come back on nigh. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in my circular walk. There were others moving around the information booth, keeping pace with me. I couldn't see them clearly in the dim light, but I could hear their footsteps, feel the displacement of air as they passed. Small figures, child-sized, staying just at the edge of my vision. I tried to call out to them, but my voice seemed to have no substance. The words dissolved into the singing, becoming part of the chorus. I was singing along now, though I didn't remember starting. My voice joined theirs in perfect harmony. Round and round the empty mall, we play until the morning. The rain on the roof had stopped, but the rhythmic tapping continued. It was coming from inside now, the sound of small feet dancing on the tiles, hens clapping in time with the endless song. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of birthday cake and candy, the sweet smell of childhood celebrations that never end. My flashlight died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness, but somehow I could still see the path around the information booth, still follow the endless circle. The other figures were clearer, now children in clothes from different eras, some in modern sneakers and jeans, others in old-fashioned dresses and suspenders. They smiled at me as we walked, their faces pale but kind, their eyes reflecting a light that came from nowhere. Round and round will always play, in shadows dark and deep. I wanted to stop, wanted to break free from the circle and run toward the exit. But the path felt like home now, the rhythm as natural as breathing. The children's voices surrounded me, welcoming me into their eternal game. They had been waiting so long for someone to join them, someone to hear their song and walk their endless circle. Round and round the empty mall, where children never sleep. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had I been walking for minutes or hours? The singing continued, beautiful and haunting, and I found I no longer wanted to leave. The circular path was comfortable, familiar. My feet knew every step. My voice knew every word of the song that was slowly changing, evolving, adding new verses about the security guard who came to check the empty mall and decided to stay and play. Round and round with friends so dear, we danced through light and shadow. I thought about my radio, sitting silent on my belt. Someone would eventually come looking for me when I failed to report back. They would find the mall empty and quiet, just as it had been for years. They would assume I had left, that I had completed my job and gone home. But I would still be here, walking the endless circle, adding my voice to the chorus of children who had found this place and made it home. The song was so beautiful, so perfect in its repetition. Each verse led naturally to the next, creating a loop that never truly ended, never grew tiresome. Round and round forevermore, in halls that time forgot. The darkness was complete now, but I could feel the presence of my new friends all around me. Their laughter echoed softly between verses, gentle and welcoming. They had been alone for so long, playing their games in the empty mall, singing their songs to no one. Now they had someone to share their eternal recess with. Round and round the circle goes, the game that never stops. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm carry me, let the song fill my mind until there was nothing else. The rain had started again outside, but here in our circular dance, we were warm and safe and together. The children's voices rose in harmony, teaching me new verses, new steps to the dance that would go on forever. Round and round, until the world grows stiller. In the morning, if morning ever came, the demolition crew would find an empty mall, just as they expected. The city would tear it down and build something new in its place. But somewhere, in the space between memory and dream, the children's song would continue, the circle would keep turning, and new friends would always be welcome to join the game that never ends. Round and round, we dance and always will. Story 3. The call came at 3 a.m, pulling me from a dreamless sleep with its sharp electronic insistence. Aunt Margaret's voice, thick with tears and exhaustion, told me that Uncle Henry had passed peacefully in his sleep. The funeral would be in 4 days. Could I help with the arrangements? I'd always been the practical one in the family, the one who organized holiday gatherings and remembered birthdays, so it was natural that I'd find myself standing in Whitmore and Son's funeral home at 8 the next morning, discussing flower arrangements and service programs with Mr. Whitmore's carefully composed assistant. The funeral home had that peculiar atmosphere of enforced serenity, soft lighting, muted colors, and the faint scent of lilies that seemed to permeate every surface. Everything was designed to provide comfort. Yet the underlying artificiality of it all created an uncanny feeling, as if grief itself were being performed rather than experienced. Uncle Henry lay in the main viewing room in a mahogany casket lined with cream silk. He looked peaceful, more rested than I'd seen him in years. The mortician had done excellent work. Uncle Henry appeared to be merely sleeping, his hands folded across his chest, his expression calm and dignified. But it was the portrait display that captured my attention. At the funeral home had created a memorial arrangement featuring photographs from Uncle Henry's life. Baby pictures, wedding photos with Aunt Margaret, snapshots from family vacations, and professional portraits spanning 8 decades. At the centerpiece was a large framed photograph taken just last year at his 80th birthday celebration. In it, Uncle Henry smiled warmly at the camera, his eyes bright with the mischievous intelligence I remembered from childhood visits to his house. I spent hours in that room over the next 3 days, greeting visitors, sharing memories, and helping Aunt Margaret navigate the overwhelming ritual of saying goodbye. The portrait display became a focal point for conversations, with guests pointing to various photographs and sharing stories about the moments captured there. It was during one of these quiet periods, late in the afternoon of the second day, that I first noticed something unusual about the central portrait. I was sitting in one of the padded chairs arranged around the viewing area, half listening to 2 of Uncle Henry's former colleagues discuss his years as a high school principal, when my gaze wandered to his birthday photograph. For just a moment, so brief I thought I might have imagined it, Uncle Henry's eyes in the portrait seemed to close and open again. A blink. I stared at the photograph, my heart rate increasing slightly. The image looked exactly as it had for the past 2 days. Uncle Henry's warm smile, his slightly rumpled cardigan, his hands resting on the back of his favorite chair. His eyes were open, looking directly at the camera with that familiar twinkle of amusement. I must have been more tired than I realized. The stress of the arrangements, the emotional weight of loss, the strange atmosphere of the funeral home. All of it was taking its toll on my perception. I made a mental note to get more sleep that night. But as I continued to sit there, pretending to listen to the ongoing conversation while keeping the portrait in my peripheral vision, it happened again. This time I was certain. Uncle Henry's eyes had definitely closed and opened in a slow, deliberate blink. The movement was subtle, lasting perhaps half a second, but unmistakable. The photograph's expression remained the same, that gentle, knowing smile, but the eyes had definitely moved. I excused myself from the conversation and walked closer to the portrait display. Up close, I could see every detail of the professional photography. The careful lighting that eliminated harsh shadows, the slight retouching that had softened some of Uncle Henry's more prominent wrinkles, the way his silver hair caught the studio lights. It was unquestionably a static image, printed on photographic paper and mounted behind glass in an ornate frame. Yet as I stood there studying it, Uncle Henry blinked again. The movement was so natural, so perfectly timed with the rhythm. I remembered from countless conversations with him. That, for a moment, I felt as if he were actually present in the room. The blink wasn't random or mechanical. It had the deliberate quality of someone acknowledging that they'd been noticed. The way Uncle Henry used to wink at me during family dinners when my parents weren't looking. I glanced around the viewing room to see if anyone else had noticed, but the handful of visitors were engaged in their own quiet conversations or private moments of reflection. No one was paying attention to the portrait display except me. Over the remainder of that afternoon and into the evening, I found myself returning to the portrait repeatedly. Sometimes Uncle Henry's eyes remained static for long periods, giving me time to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But inevitably, just as I was beginning to doubt my own perception, he would blink again. The pattern seemed to follow no particular schedule. Sometimes the blinks came in quick succession, like someone trying to clear their vision or signal for attention. Other times, long minutes would pass before the eyes would slowly close and open again in what looked like a satisfied, drowsy blink. I began to time my visits to the portrait during moments when I was alone in the room. During these private observations, the blinking seemed to increase in frequency, as if Uncle Henry were more comfortable displaying this impossible behavior when no one else was watching. On the morning of the third day, I decided to conduct a test. I positioned myself in front of the portrait during a quiet period and spoke to it in a whisper. "Uncle Henry, if you can hear me, blink once." Nothing happened for several seconds. Then, slowly and deliberately, the eyes in the photograph closed and opened once. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was coincidence. That grief and stress had created a pattern, seeking behavior that was making me interpret random visual fluctuations as meaningful communication. But the emotional part of me, the part that had loved Uncle Henry since childhood, recognized something in that deliberate blink that was unmistakably him. I tried again. "Blink twice if you're okay." Oh, too clear. Distinct blinks. The conversation that followed was limited by the nature of yes or no questions, but it was undeniably a conversation. Uncle Henry indicated that he was aware of the funeral proceedings, that he approved of the arrangements, and that he was concerned about Aunt Margaret's well-being. His responses came not just through the timing of his blinks, but through subtle changes in his expression. A slight softening around the eyes when we discussed happy memories. A barely perceptible tightening when I mentioned Aunt Margaret's difficulty coping with his loss. That evening, after the last visitors had left and the funeral home had closed to the public, I remained in the viewing room with Uncle Henry's casket and his portrait. Mr. Whitmore had granted me permission to spend some private time there, understanding that sometimes the grieving process required solitude. In the dimmed lighting of the after-hours funeral home, Uncle Henry's photographic presence became even more pronounced. The blinking continued, but now it was accompanied by what seemed like subtle shifts in his expression. The smile remained constant, but the eyes conveyed a range of emotions: amusement, concern, affection, and something that might have been urgency. I pulled a chair close to the portrait display and settled in for what felt like the most important conversation of my life. "Is there something you want me to know?" I asked. A single, emphatic blink. We developed a system over the next hour. 1 blink for yes, 2 for no. Rapid blinking for emphasis. Through this laborious process, Uncle Henry communicated that there was something hidden in his house that Aunt Margaret needed to find. Something that would provide for her financial security in ways she didn't yet understand. He guided me through a series of increasingly specific questions about locations within his home. Not in the obvious places. Not in his desk or filing cabinet or bedroom safe. Somewhere unexpected. Somewhere that only he would have thought to use. The grandfather clock in the living room. Behind the weights. A safety deposit box key, and a handwritten note explaining investments he'd made over the years, but had never mentioned to anyone. Not even Aunt Margaret. He'd been planning to tell her on their next anniversary, but the heart attack had come too suddenly. As the night deepened and the funeral home settled into complete silence around us, our conversation took on an increasingly intimate tone. Uncle Henry's blinks became more nuanced, conveying not just information but emotion. When I told him how much he'd meant to me growing up, how his patient guidance had helped shape who I'd become, the photograph's eyes seemed to shimmer with what, in a living person, I would have called unshed tears. I found myself crying as I spoke to him, releasing grief I'd been holding back for 3 days of practical arrangements and social obligations. In the privacy of that dimmed room, with only Uncle Henry's impossible presence for company, I could finally acknowledge the magnitude of this loss and the depth of my love for this man who had been like a second father to me. The portrait listened with the patient attention I remembered from our lifetime of conversations. Uncle Henry had always been an exceptional listener, someone who gave you his complete focus when you needed to talk. Death, it seemed, hadn't changed that quality. As dawn began to filter through the funeral home's stained glass windows, I realized that the day of the service had arrived. Soon, the building would fill with mourners, and this private communion would end. Uncle Henry seemed to sense this too. His blinking became more frequent, more urgent, as if he were trying to communicate everything important before our time ran out. "Will you be able to? Will this continue after the funeral?" I asked. 2 slow blinks. No. The service itself passed in a blur of hymns and eulogies and final farewells. I delivered a speech about Uncle Henry's dedication to education and his quiet generosity. But my attention kept drifting to the portrait display. Throughout the ceremony, his photographic eyes remained static, giving no sign of the extraordinary behavior I'd witnessed over the past 3 days. Afterward, as the funeral home staff prepared to transport Uncle Henry's casket to the cemetery, I approached the portrait one final time. The room was empty except for a few family members gathering their personal belongings. "Thank you," I whispered to the photograph. "For everything. For all the years of guidance, and for these last few days of whatever this was." Uncle Henry's eyes closed in a long, slow blink that seemed to contain a lifetime of affection and farewell. When they opened again, they held the same warm expression they'd always had, but the spark of active consciousness was gone. The photograph had returned to being simply a photograph, a beautiful memorial to a life well lived, but no longer a window into something beyond ordinary experience. 3 days later, I drove to Aunt Margaret's house and helped her search the grandfather clock. We found the safety deposit box key exactly where Uncle Henry had indicated, along with a note in his handwriting that began, "My dearest Margaret. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to take care of you in person. But I hope I've managed to take care of you anyway." The investments he'd quietly made over the decades ensured that Aunt Margaret would be comfortable for the rest of her life. She cried when I showed her the documentation, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. "How did you know to look there?" she asked. I considered telling her the truth, but some experiences are too fragile to survive skeptical examination. Instead, I said, Uncle Henry always was full of surprises. I just had a feeling he might have left us one more. The portrait now hangs in Aunt Margaret's living room, occupying a place of honor above the mantelpiece. Whenever I visit, I find myself studying Uncle Henry's photographed face, looking for some sign of the extraordinary awareness I witnessed during those 3 days at the funeral home. But the eyes never blink now. They simply smile their eternal smile, keeping whatever secrets they might hold locked safely behind the glass that separates the living from the remembered. Sometimes, though, late in the evening, when the light in the living room grows soft and golden, I catch myself talking to the portrait, not expecting a response. I understand that whatever window had opened during those funeral home nights has closed permanently. But talking nonetheless, because some conversations transcend the boundaries between presence and absence, between the possible and the impossible. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I think I see a subtle shift in Uncle Henry's expression, a slight deepening of that familiar smile, as if he's listening still, even if he can no longer respond. The boundary between memory and reality, between grief and comfort, between the living and the departed, proves more porous than I ever imagined. In the space where love persists beyond physical presence, perhaps anything is possible, even a photograph that blinks with the gentle rhythm of eternal affection. But that's a secret I carry alone now. One more gift from Uncle Henry in a lifetime full of his quiet generosity. Story 4. I moved to the cabin at Pine Ridge specifically for the silence. After 15 years in the city, where sirens and traffic and the constant hum of urban life had gradually eroded my ability to concentrate, I craved the profound quiet that only deep woods could provide. The real estate listing had promised complete privacy on 40 acres of mature forest. And when I first walked the property line, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks whose canopy filtered the daylight into shifting patterns of green and gold. My nearest neighbor was 3 miles away by winding dirt road, and the forest stretched unbroken for miles in every direction. It was exactly the solitude I needed to finish my novel and recover from the nervous exhaustion that had been building for years. For the first 2 weeks, the isolation was perfect. I established a routine of writing in the mornings, hiking the forest paths in the afternoons, and reading by the fire in the evenings. The only sounds were natural ones: wind through leaves, the distant call of owls, the occasional crack of a branch settling in the darkness. I slept better than I had in years, lulled by the absolute quiet of the deep woods. the light appeared on my 15th night. I was sitting by the living room window, reading a biography of Virginia Woolf, when something flickered in my peripheral vision. Through the glass, I saw a beam of light moving slowly through the trees about 100 yards from the cabin. At first glance, it looked like a flashlight beam, steady, focused, clearly artificial rather than natural. My first thought was that someone was lost. The forest could be disorienting even in daylight, and hikers occasionally wandered off the marked trails. I set down my book and watched the light move in what seemed like a systematic search pattern, sweeping slowly from left to right through the trees. I should have gone outside to offer help, but something about the light's movement made me hesitate. It moved too deliberately, too methodically, for someone who was lost and looking for a way out. Instead, it seemed to be searching for something specific, moving in careful grid patterns through the forest with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. After about 20 minutes, the light disappeared deeper into the woods, and I convinced myself it had been a park ranger or forestry service worker conducting some kind of evening survey. The forest was part of a larger conservation area. Official nighttime activities weren't uncommon. But the light returned the next night, and the night after that. Each evening, sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock, the beam would appear in the same general area of forest. It always moved in the same methodical pattern, slow, careful sweeps from tree to tree, occasionally pausing as if its operator had found something of interest, then continuing its systematic search. By the fourth night, I was waiting for it. I positioned myself at the window with a cup of coffee and my reading, but my attention was entirely focused on the dark spaces between the trees. When the light appeared, I studied it more carefully. The beam was definitely artificial, too steady and focused to be moonlight or any natural phenomenon. But there was something odd about its quality. Most flashlight beams create a distinct circle of bright illumination with clearly defined edges. This light seemed softer, more diffuse, as if it were being filtered through something translucent. More unsettling was the complete silence that accompanied it. Even from inside the cabin, I should have been able to hear something. Footsteps on the forest floor, the snap of twigs, maybe even distant voices if there were multiple people involved. But the light moved through the woods without creating any sound at all, gliding between the trees with an eerie quietness that made me question whether I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing. I decided to investigate. On the fifth night, I prepared for an expedition. I dressed in dark clothing. I equipped myself with a powerful LED flashlight and a digital camera, and positioned myself outside the cabin well before the usual appearance time. If this was some kind of official forest activity, I wanted to understand what was happening so close to my new home. If it was something else, trespassers, perhaps, or illegal hunting, I needed to know about that too. The October air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of dying leaves and pine sap. I crouched behind a large oak tree, about 50 yards from where the light typically appeared, my own flashlight off to avoid detection. The darkness under the forest canopy was profound, without moonlight filtering through the leaves. I could barely see my own hands. At 9:47 p.m., the light appeared. It emerged from deeper in the woods. moving toward my position with its characteristic slow, methodical pace. As it drew closer, I could see that it wasn't quite like any flashlight beam I'd encountered before. The light seemed to emanate from a source that was both smaller and more diffuse than a standard flashlight, creating an illumination that reminded me more of phosphorescence than electric light. But it was the silence that truly unsettled me. The light moved through the underbrush without disturbing it, passed between trees without the sound of footsteps, created no noise whatsoever despite covering significant ground. I strained my ears, trying to detect even the slightest sound that would indicate a human presence. But the forest remained as quiet as a tomb. When the light was perhaps 20 feet away from my hiding spot, I turned on my own flashlight and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The light stopped immediately. For a long moment, we remained frozen in our respective positions. Me behind the oak tree, with my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The mysterious light hovering motionless between two pine trees. In the harsh white glare of my LED light, I could see the area where the other light should be originating, but there was nothing there. No person, no equipment, no source for the illumination I could clearly see. The light was simply there, existing without any visible cause. I called out again, my voice less steady this time. "I live in the cabin over there. Are you lost? Do you need help?" No response. But slowly, almost reluctantly, the light began to retreat deeper into the forest. It moved in a straight line now, abandoning its methodical search pattern for what looked like a direct route away from my position. I followed, moving through the forest at night, even with a powerful flashlight, required careful attention to avoid roots and low branches. But I was determined to solve this mystery, to find some rational explanation for what I'd been observing. I moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, keeping the retreating light in sight while navigating the obstacles of the forest floor. The pursuit continued for perhaps half a mile, leading me deeper into the woods than I'd ever ventured during my daytime hikes. The trees grew denser here, their branches interweaving overhead to create a canopy so thick that even daylight would barely penetrate it. My flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, creating only a small bubble of visibility around me. Ahead, the mysterious light continued its retreat, maintaining a consistent distance despite my efforts to close the gap. It moved with an ease that defied the difficult terrain, never pausing to navigate obstacles or changing direction to avoid barriers. It simply moved, as if the physical forest presented no impediment to its passage. Finally, in a small clearing dominated by a massive fallen oak, the light stopped. I approached cautiously, my flashlight aimed at the spot where the light hovered. In the intersection of our two beams, I could see every detail of the clearing: the moss-covered trunk of the fallen tree, the small saplings that had begun to grow in the gap created by its fall, the carpet of decomposing leaves that covered the forest floor. But I still couldn't see the source of the other light. "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The light pulsed once, a brief intensification that might have been a response or might have been coincidence. Then, slowly, it began to fade, not moving away this time, but actually dimming, becoming less and less substantial until it disappeared entirely, leaving me alone in the clearing with only my own flashlight for illumination. The return journey to the cabin was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Every shadow seemed to conceal a presence, every sound. The rustle of leaves, the crack of settling branches, suggested that I was being watched or followed. My flashlight battery began to weaken, reducing my field of vision and increasing my sense of vulnerability. But I made it back to the cabin without incident, and spent the rest of the night researching possible explanations for what I'd witnessed. Ball lightning, though usually associated with thunderstorms, could occasionally occur under other conditions. Bioluminescent fungi or gases might create unusual light phenomena in forest environments. There were even documented cases of electromagnetic anomalies creating phantom lights in certain geographical areas. None of these explanations fully accounted for what I'd observed, but they provided enough rational framework to help me sleep. The light didn't appear the following night, or the night after that. For nearly a week, my evening vigils at the window revealed nothing but ordinary darkness. I began to convince myself that my encounter in the clearing had been some kind of conclusion, that whatever phenomenon I'd witnessed had run its course and moved on to other mysteries. I was wrong. When the light returned, it was different. Instead of appearing in its usual location and following its methodical search pattern, it materialized directly outside my cabin windows, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the glass separating us. I was reading in bed when it happened, the familiar soft glow catching my attention through the bedroom curtains. But when I parted the fabric to look outside, the light was right there, hovering just beyond the window pane like a luminous visitor requesting entry. Up close, I could see details that had been invisible from a distance. The light wasn't uniform. It had texture, variation, almost like the play of sunlight through water. It pulsed gently with a rhythm that reminded me of breathing, or perhaps a slow heartbeat. And within its diffuse glow, I thought I could detect shapes, shadows, forms that suggested structure without quite revealing what that structure might be. I approached the window slowly, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and fascination. The light seemed to track my movement, shifting slightly to maintain what felt like eye contact, despite having no visible eyes. When I pressed my palm against the glass, the light moved closer until only the thin barrier of the window separated us. The glass grew warm under my touch. We remained like that for several minutes. Me standing at my bedroom window in my pajamas, the light hovering just outside, both of us seemingly studying the other. The experience felt intensely personal, like a conversation conducted entirely through presence and attention rather than words. Finally, the light began to move again, but slowly this time, invitingly, as if encouraging me to follow. It drifted away from the window and toward the forest edge, pausing frequently to ensure I was watching. I dressed quickly and went outside. The night air was colder than usual, carrying the sharp scent of approaching winter. The light waited for me at the edge of the clearing, pulsing with what I'd learned to interpret as patience. When I stepped into the forest, it began to move, leading me along paths I'd never explored during my daytime hikes. This time, our journey felt less like a pursuit and more like a guided tour. The light moved at a pace that allowed me to navigate safely. occasionally pausing when I stumbled or needed to catch my breath. It led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured, through groves of ancient trees and across small streams that reflected its glow like scattered stars. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a place I'd never seen before, a natural amphitheater formed by a ring of enormous pines, their trunks so massive and their canopy so dense that the space felt like a cathedral. At the center of this circle stood something that made me question everything I thought I understood about the forest. It was a structure, but not one built by human hands. Arranged in careful patterns were stones, branches, and what looked like crystalline formations that caught and reflected the light in impossible ways. The arrangement was clearly artificial, clearly intentional, but created according to an aesthetic and logic that felt utterly alien. My guiding light moved to the center of this strange construction and settled there, its glow intensifying until the entire amphitheater was illuminated with soft, phosphorescent radiance. In that light, I could see that the forest clearing was far from empty. There were others, not people. I understood that immediately. But presences, consciousness, entities that existed in the spaces between visible and invisible, between known and unknowable. They manifested as variations of light, each with its own character and intensity, arranged around the perimeter of the clearing, like an audience gathering for a performance. I stood at the edge of this assembly, acutely aware that I was witnessing something that existed entirely outside human experience. The lights communicated with each other through patterns of intensity and movement that suggested a complex language, a form of discourse that had nothing to do with sound or symbol. And gradually, I realized that I could understand fragments of it, not the specifics. The content remained utterly foreign to my human consciousness, but I could sense the emotional undertones, the rhythms of question and response, the flow of information being shared among beings whose existence I couldn't have imagined just weeks earlier. They were ancient. I understood that somehow. They had been in this forest for longer than the trees themselves, longer than the land had taken its current shape. They were connected to the place in ways that went beyond mere habitation. They were part of its essential nature, as integral to the forest's identity as soil and root and leaf. And they had been watching me since I arrived. My presence in the cabin, my evening observations, my attempts to investigate their activities, all of it had been noted and discussed among them. Tonight's invitation was the result of some kind of collective decision, a judgment that I was ready to be brought into their awareness. The light that had been my guide moved toward me again, and I felt a gentle pressure in my mind, not intrusive, but unmistakably present. Images began to form in my consciousness. Not memories, but something more like shared experiences. I saw the forest as it had existed centuries ago, before human settlement, when these beings of light moved freely through the woods, without the need for concealment. I saw the gradual retreat as roads and houses carved up their ancient territories, the adaptation to smaller and more hidden spaces, the patient waiting for times and places where they could emerge safely. I saw other humans, too, individuals throughout history who had encountered these presences and been changed by the experience. Some had fled in terror, carrying stories that became local legends about ghost lights and supernatural phenomena. Others had been drawn into deeper contact, becoming intermediaries between the visible and invisible worlds. The images faded, but the presence in my mind remained, gentle and questioning. I understood that I was being offered a choice: return to my normal life with the memory of this encounter, gradually fading into something I could dismiss as imagination, or accept a role as a bridge between their world and mine. The decision required no consideration. I'd been seeking something in the isolation of the forest, though I hadn't been able to articulate what. Now I understood that I'd been seeking exactly this: contact with a form of consciousness that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. I nodded my acceptance, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. The response was immediate. The assembled lights began to move in complex patterns, weaving between the trees and around the strange central structure in what could only be described as a dance of welcome. My guide's illumination intensified, and I felt a warm sensation spreading through my chest, as if something fundamental in my internal architecture was being gently adjusted. When the dance concluded, the lights began to fade one by one until only my guide remained. It approached me a final time, pulsing once in what felt like gratitude, then disappeared into the darkness. The return journey to the cabin was different from any walk I'd ever taken. Though I was alone and the light was gone, I was never truly in darkness. I could sense the presence of the forest in ways that had nothing to do with sight. The living network of root and branch and leaf. The consciousness that flowed through every growing thing. The subtle communication that connected all life in this place. When I reached the cabin, I understood that I was no longer the same person who had moved here seeking solitude. I had found something far more profound than quiet. I had found connection to a form of existence I hadn't known was possible. The lights continue to appear, but our relationship has evolved beyond observation and investigation. I've become part of their world, just as they've become part of mine. Sometimes I join them in the forest amphitheater for gatherings I don't fully understand, but find deeply meaningful. Sometimes they visit me at the cabin, their gentle glow providing comfort during difficult writing sessions or lonely evenings. My novel has taken an unexpected direction. What began as a straightforward literary work has become something else entirely. An attempt to translate experiences that exist beyond language into words that might help others recognize similar encounters in their own lives. The forest has taught me that consciousness takes many forms, that intelligence exists in patterns and places we never think to look, and that the boundary between self and world is far more permeable than we imagine. In seeking solitude, I found the deepest form of communion possible. Late at night, when I'm writing by the window, I sometimes see other lights moving through distant parts of the forest. New ones, different in character from my original guides. The phenomenon is spreading, or perhaps I'm simply becoming more aware of what was always there. Last week, I noticed lights beginning to appear in the woods near the next cabin down the mountain road. The new resident is a retired professor, someone else seeking peace and quiet after years of urban chaos. She's begun leaving her porch light on later into the evening, and I've seen her standing at her windows. looking out into the forest with the same expression. I must have worn during those first nights of observation. I should probably introduce myself soon, offer her some friendly advice about living in such an isolated area. There are things she should know about the forest, about the importance of remaining open to experiences that challenge conventional understanding. After all, she's been chosen too. The lights don't appear for everyone who moves to these woods. They're selective, patient, waiting for individuals who are ready for contact, ready to have their understanding of reality gently, but permanently expanded. I think I'll bake some bread tomorrow and walk over to her place. We'll have coffee and talk about the challenges of forest living, the beauty of the changing seasons, the profound quiet that makes sleep so restful out here. And if she mentions seeing strange lights moving through the trees at night, I'll listen with the perfect attention I learned from Uncle Henry. And I'll help her understand that she's about to embark on the most extraordinary journey of her life. The forest has many secrets, and it's always looking for the right people to share them with. Story 5. The Grandview Apartments had been my home for 3 months, and I thought I knew every sound the old building made. The heating pipes that clanked like chains at dawn, the elevator that wheezed and groaned between floors, the way Mrs. Peterson's television echoed through the thin walls, always tuned to game shows that seemed to play at all hours. But on that Thursday evening in late November, as I climbed the stairs to my 4th floor apartment, I heard something new. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps in the hallway above me. I paused on the 3rd floor landing, listening. The steps were irregular, playful, the kind of gait a child might have when skipping or dancing, rather than simply walking. They moved from one end of the hallway to the other, paused, then returned. Back and forth, with a rhythm that was almost musical. When I reached the 4th floor, the hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their usual harsh glare on the faded carpet and numbered doors. The steps had stopped, but I could feel a presence lingering in the air, like the echo of laughter after the joke has ended. I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder as I unlocked apartment 4C. The feeling of being watched was so strong that my skin prickled. But every time I turned, I saw only empty hallways stretching in both directions. The silence felt unnatural after the dancing footsteps I'd heard moments before. Inside my apartment, I tried to settle into my evening routine. Dinner, television, a book before bed. But I found myself distracted by sounds from the hallway or the absence of them. The building's usual symphony of creaking pipes and settling beams seemed muted, as if something was absorbing the familiar noises. I caught myself walking to the door repeatedly, pressing my ear against the wood, listening for those light footsteps to return. They came back around midnight. I was lying in bed, drifting toward sleep, when I heard them start up again. The same playful rhythm, moving back and forth along the hallway outside my door. But now there was something else, a soft humming, barely audible through the walls. A child's voice, carrying a simple melody that seemed familiar, but which I couldn't quite place. I got up and crept to the peephole, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. Through the fish-eye lens, I could see a distorted view of the hallway, stretched and curved, but clearly empty. The humming continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but I could see no source for the sound. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mr. Rodriguez from 4A as we waited for the elevator. He frowned, his weathered face creasing with concern. "A little girl. You sure about that?" He shook his head slowly. "Ain't been no kids on this floor for months. Mrs. Chen in 4D moved out back in August. Took her granddaughter with her. Place has been quiet since then." But it wasn't quiet. Over the following days, I began to notice the sounds more frequently. Always in the evening, always the same pattern, light footsteps moving up and down the hallway, sometimes accompanied by that wordless humming. The melody was clearer now, and I recognized it as something from my own childhood, though I couldn't remember where I'd first heard it. The sounds began to feel familiar, even comforting. I started looking forward to them, timing my evening activities around what I came to think of as the nightly performance. I would finish dinner, wash dishes, then settle into my reading chair to listen for the first soft footfalls outside my door. It was on the following Tuesday that I first saw her. I had been reading when the footsteps began, earlier than usual. The humming was different too, more complex, with little flourishes and variations that suggested someone getting comfortable with a familiar song. I found myself humming along quietly, my voice blending with the sound from the hallway. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, waiting. Usually, the sounds continued their back and forth pattern for 20 minutes or more before fading away. This pause was new, unexpected. I set down my book and moved toward the door, each step carefully placed to avoid any creaking floorboards. At the peephole, I pressed my eye to the lens and saw her immediately. She was small, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair that hung in loose curls to her shoulders. She wore a simple dress, white or pale yellow. It was difficult to tell in the hallway's harsh lighting. She stood perfectly still in the center of the hallway, facing my door, her head tilted slightly downward so that her hair obscured her face. She was so motionless that she might have been a photograph, except for the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. The humming had stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. We remained frozen in this strange tableau, me watching through the peephole, her standing in patient stillness just a few feet away. Then, slowly, she raised her head. Even through the distortion of the fish-eye lens, I could see that her face was pale, delicate, with large dark eyes that seemed older than her apparent age. She looked directly at the peephole, directly at me, and smiled. It was a shy smile, the kind a child might give to a friendly stranger, but there was something else in it, a knowing quality that made my skin crawl. She lifted her hand and waved, a small gesture of greeting that sent me stumbling backward from the door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed myself against the opposite wall, staring at the door, as if she might walk through it at any moment. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole again, she was gone. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, showing no trace of her presence. But I could still feel those dark eyes watching me, could still see that knowing smile behind my closed eyelids. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound from the hallway sent me creeping back to the door, but each time I looked, I saw nothing. The building seemed to hold its breath around me, waiting for something I couldn't name. The next evening, I almost didn't go to the peephole when the footsteps began. But the pull was too strong. I needed to know if she would appear again, needed to understand what was happening in the hallway outside my safe, familiar apartment. This time, she was standing closer to the door. Close enough that I could see the individual eyelashes framing her dark eyes. She was looking directly at the peephole again, as if she knew exactly where I would be. Her smile was brighter this time, more confident. She raised her hand and pressed her palm against the door, directly over where the peephole was located. The gesture was so precise, so deliberate, that I gasped and jumped back. When I looked again, she had stepped back to her original position. She tilted her head to one side, studying me through the lens, then opened her mouth and spoke. I couldn't hear the words through the door, but I could see her lips moving, forming what looked like a question. Over the following nights, our silent encounters became routine. She would appear in the hallway, always at the same time, always wearing the same pale dress. Sometimes she would wave, sometimes she would simply stand and watch. Occasionally, she would mouth words that I couldn't understand, her lips moving in careful, deliberate shapes that seemed important somehow. I began to feel as though we were developing a relationship of sorts. She was patient with my obvious fear, never making sudden movements or aggressive gestures. Her presence became less threatening and more lonely. There was something in her posture, in the way she stood so still in the empty hallway, that spoke of profound isolation. On Friday night, she did something different. Instead of simply standing and watching, she walked slowly to my door and sat down in front of it, cross-legged like a child waiting for story time. She rested her chin in her hands and looked up at the peephole with an expression of patient expectation. I found myself sinking to the floor on my side of the door, mirroring her position without conscious thought. We sat like that for what felt like hours, her in the hallway, me in my apartment, and separated by a few inches of wood, but somehow sharing the same space. The building around us seemed to recognize this moment of connection. Even the usual settling noises faded to silence, as if we were the only two people left in the world. That's when I heard her voice clearly for the first time. "Do you want to play?" The words came through the door as clearly as if she were sitting beside me rather than on the other side. Her voice was exactly what I would have expected, sweet, young, with that particular clarity that children's voices have. But underneath the innocent words, there was something else, a weight, a sadness that no child should carry. I pressed my palm against the door, matching the position where she had placed her hand before. "What kind of game?" I whispered back. "Hide and seek," she replied immediately, as if she had been waiting for this conversation her entire existence. "I've been hiding for so long, but I don't want to hide anymore." Through the peephole, I could see her looking up at me with those large, dark eyes. Her expression was hopeful but cautious, like someone who had been disappointed many times before. I realized that she wasn't asking me to hide, she was asking me to seek. She was tired of being the one who was hidden, invisible, alone in the empty hallways of the world. "How long have you been hiding?" I asked. She considered this question seriously, her small face scrunching in concentration. "Since the fire," she said finally. "Since everyone went away." Fire. The word sent a chill through me, though I didn't understand why. I had lived in the Grandview apartments for months without hearing any mention of a fire. The building was old but well maintained, with modern fire safety systems installed throughout. If there had been a fire significant enough to what? To take a child? "What fire?" I whispered. But she was already standing up, smoothing down her pale dress with small, careful hands. "You have to find me," she said, her voice growing fainter, even though she hadn't moved farther from the door. "I can't keep hiding forever." "Wait," I called, scrambling to my feet and pressing my face to the peephole. "Where are you going?" She looked back at me one more time, her smile sad but genuine. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I never go anywhere." "But you have to look for me with more than just your eyes." The hallway began to grow dim, though the fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead. The light seemed to drain away from around her, creating a pool of shadow that expanded outward from where she stood. Within that shadow, her pale dress glowed softly, the only bright thing in an increasingly dark world. "My name is Emma," she said, and her voice seemed to come from very far away now, though I could still see her clearly through the peephole. "I lived in 4B, before the fire. The 4B. The apartment directly across from mine." I looked through the peephole toward that door, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw light seeping out from under it, warm yellow light like candlelight or lamplight. But when I blinked, both the light and the little girl were gone, leaving only the empty hallway and its harsh fluorescent glare. I stayed at the door for the rest of the night, checking the peephole every few minutes, but Emma didn't return. The building gradually came back to life around me, pipes clanking, floors creaking, the distant sound of Mrs. Peterson's television. But underneath these familiar noises, I could swear I heard something else. The soft sound of a child crying, muffled and distant, coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. The next morning, I knocked on the door of the building manager's office on the first floor. Mrs. Kowalski was a practical woman in her 60s who had been managing the Grandview for over a decade. She looked up from her paperwork with the expression of someone accustomed to tenant complaints about noise, heat, and broken appliances. "Fire," she repeated when I asked about the building's history. "What kind of fire?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling foolish. "Something that happened before I moved in. Maybe someone was hurt." Her expression softened slightly, and she gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. "There was a fire," she said slowly. "Not in the building, but in 4B specifically, about 2 years ago now. Electrical fault, we think, happened in the middle of the night." My mouth went dry. Was anyone hurt? Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. The tenant was a young woman named Sarah Chen. She was Mrs. Chen's daughter from 4D. You know, the lady who moved out a few months back. Sarah had a little girl, Emma, 7 years old. The room seemed to tilt around me. What happened to them? Sarah got out, Mrs. Kowalski said quietly. But Emma, by the time the fire department got there, the smoke inhalation, she didn't make it. I stared at her, trying to process this information. Where is Sarah now? Couldn't handle living here after what happened. She moved away, and Mrs. Chen followed her a few months later. Wanted to be close to her daughter, help her through the grief. Mrs. Kowalski leaned forward in her chair. Why are you asking about this? Has someone been bothering you? I left without answering her question, my mind reeling with the implications of what she'd told me. Emma had died in apartment 4B, directly across from where I now lived. She had been hiding in the hallways ever since, waiting for someone to notice her, to acknowledge her presence, to play with her. That evening, I didn't wait for the footsteps to begin. As soon as the sun set, I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their usual harsh shadows, but I could feel a change in the atmosphere. The air was warmer, more welcoming, tinged with the faint scent of something sweet, cookies baking, perhaps, or birthday cake. Emma, I called softly. I want to play your game. The response came immediately. The lights dimmed, not going out completely, but softening to a warm, golden glow. I could hear footsteps now, but they weren't coming from the hallway around me. They were coming from above, from below, from inside the walls themselves. The sound of a child running and playing, echoing through dimensions I couldn't see, but could somehow feel. You have to find me. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on a breeze that smelled of summer afternoons and innocence lost. But remember, I'm not really hiding. I'm right where I've always been. I walked to the door of apartment 4B and placed my palm against the wood. It was warm, almost hot, and I could feel a gentle vibration running through it, like a heartbeat or the purr of a contented cat. Behind the door, I could hear sounds of life, footsteps, soft humming, the rustle of fabric as someone moved around in the space beyond. Are you in there, Emma? I'm everywhere, she replied, and now her voice seemed to come from inside my own head. I'm in the walls, in the floors, in the spaces between moments. I'm in your memory now, too, which means I'm not completely alone anymore. I pressed my forehead against the door of 4B, feeling the warmth seep through my skin. What do you need from me? Just remember, she whispered. Remember that I was here. Remember that I was real. Remember that I had a mother who loved me and a grandmother who made cookies and dreams about growing up and having adventures. The warmth under my hand began to fade, and I could feel her presence growing distant. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment or disappearance. It felt like completion, like the end of a long journey. Thank you for playing with me. Emma's voice came one last time, soft and grateful. Thank you for finding me. The hallway returned to its normal harsh lighting, the fluorescent tubes buzzing and flickering as they always had. But something had changed fundamentally. The building felt lighter somehow, as if a weight that had been pressing down on it for years had finally been lifted. I never saw Emma again, but I didn't need to. She was no longer hiding, no longer trapped in the endless game of seeking without being found. She had been acknowledged, remembered, given the recognition and love that every child deserves. And in being found, she had finally been able to let go. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear faint laughter in the hallways, not the lonely, longing sound of before, but the genuine joy of a child at play. It would drift through the building like music, touching every apartment, every resident, reminding us all that we were not alone, that even in our individual spaces, we were part of something larger. The Grandview Apartments was still old, still creaky, still filled with the usual sounds of urban life. But now it also held something else, the memory of a little girl who had learned that sometimes the best way to stop hiding is to trust someone else to seek. And in seeking her, in remembering her, I had found something I didn't know I was looking for. The understanding that loneliness is just another game. And like all games, it's always more fun when you're not playing it alone. Story 6. The Sleepy Pine Motel wasn't much to look at, but it was the only place for 50 miles with a vacancy sign still glowing in the October drizzle. The neon AP flickered intermittently, making the sign read Sleeyn Motel in stuttering pink light. I pulled my rental car under the narrow overhang and sat for a moment, listening to the rain tap against the windshield in an oddly rhythmic pattern. The office smelled of stale cigarettes and pine air freshener, a combination that somehow made the small space feel even smaller. The clerk behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. He was thin and pale, with the kind of complexion that suggested he rarely saw sunlight. "Room for one?" he asked, though I was clearly alone. "Just for the night?" I replied, sliding my credit card across the worn Formica counter. "Something quiet, if you have it." He chuckled dryly. "Quiet's about all we got here, friend. You're our only guest tonight." He handed me a key attached to a diamond, shaped plastic fob marked with the number 7. End unit. Nice and private. The walk to room 7 felt longer than it should have, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walkway, despite the motel being only 1 story. The sound seemed to bounce back from somewhere far away, as if the building stretched much deeper than it appeared. Each footfall produced not just the expected echo, but a secondary sound, softer, slightly delayed, like someone else walking just out of sync with my steps. Room 7 was at the far end of the building, separated from the next unit by what looked like an unusually wide gap. The key turned easily, and I stepped into a space that felt immediately familiar, though I was certain I'd never been here before. The room was clean but dated, with wood, paneled walls, and a bedspread in a pattern that might have been fashionable in the 1970s. The carpet was a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb sound, making my movements unnaturally quiet. I set my overnight bag on the bed and went to close the curtains. Through the window, I could see my rental car alone under the overhang, rain pooling around its tires in perfect circles. The parking lot stretched into darkness, beyond the reach of the single security light. And I found myself staring into that darkness longer than I should have, as if expecting to see something move just at the edge of the light. The shower was hot and strong, a pleasant surprise after the day's long drive. I stood under the spray, letting the heat work out the knots in my shoulders. When I heard it for the first time, a soft sound from somewhere in the room beyond. Not quite a footstep, not quite a settling noise. More like fabric brushing against a wall, or breath being held, and then slowly released. I turned off the water and listened. The rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, but underneath it, I could swear I heard movement. Careful, deliberate movement, as if someone was trying very hard not to be heard. I wrapped a towel around my waist and crept to the bathroom door, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. But it was the wrong kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of held breath, of someone waiting. I eased the door open and peered into the room. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My bag on the bed, my clothes folded on the chair. The front door was still chained and bolted from the inside. The window remained locked, curtains drawn tight. I convinced myself it was just the settling of an old building, the kind of sounds every structure makes as it adjusts to the changing temperature and humidity. I dressed in my sleep clothes and settled into bed with a book, though I found it difficult to concentrate on the words. The rain created a white noise that should have been soothing, but instead it seemed to mask other sounds, subtle movements that I couldn't quite identify or locate. I must have dozed, because I woke with a start to find the book fallen closed beside me and the bedside lamp still burning. The digital clock showed 11:47 p.m. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No traffic sounds, no settling noises from the building, not even the hum of the heating unit. Just perfect, absolute quiet. That's when I heard the first knock. It was soft, almost hesitant. 3 gentle taps on the door, so quiet I might have imagined them. I lay still, listening, wondering if it had been part of a dream. The red numbers on the clock shifted to 11:48, and the sound came again. 3 soft knocks, identical in rhythm and intensity to the first. I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the door, my feet silent on the thick carpet. The peephole showed nothing but darkness, not the parking lot darkness I expected, but absolute black, as if something was pressed against the other side of the lens. I leaned closer, trying to make out any detail, when the knocking came again. 3 taps, so close to my ear that I jumped back from the door. "Hello," I called softly. "Who's there?" The silence that followed seemed to press against my eardrums. I waited, counting heartbeats, before trying again. Someone there. This time, the answer came not as words, but as another set of knocks. 3 gentle taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. The pattern was exactly the same, as if whoever was outside was simply repeating the same gesture over and over, like a recording stuck in a loop. I pressed my eye to the peephole again. Still darkness, but now I thought I could detect movement within that black space, a slight shifting, like fabric stirring in a breeze that didn't exist. The darkness seemed to pulse slightly, growing deeper and then lighter, as if something was moving closer to the door and then stepping back. The knocking continued, maintaining its perfect rhythm. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. I found my own heartbeat beginning to synchronize with the pattern, and I had to consciously force myself to breathe at a different tempo. There was something hypnotic about the repetition, something that made me want to unlock the door and swing it open, just to break the endless cycle. I retreated to the bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. But the knocking followed me, seeming to come not just from the door now, but from the walls themselves. The same gentle rhythm, but multiplied, as if several people were standing around the room's perimeter, all knocking in perfect unison. The clock showed 12:15 a.m., then 12:30, then 1900. The knocking never stopped, never varied in intensity or rhythm. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause over and over, until the sound became like breathing, so constant that I only noticed it when I tried to focus on something else. At some point, I realized I was no longer lying in bed, but standing at the door again, my hand on the chain lock. I had no memory of getting up, no awareness of crossing the room. The knocking was directly on the other side of the wood now, so close I could feel the vibrations through the door frame. My fingers fumbled with the chain, though I couldn't remember deciding to open it. The peephole showed the same absolute darkness, but now I could hear breathing on the other side. Soft, steady breaths that matched the rhythm of the knocking. In during the taps, hold during the pause, then out before the next set of knocks. It was the breathing of someone who was trying to stay very calm, very controlled, despite some great excitement or anticipation. I found myself breathing along with the pattern. In, hold, out. My hand remained on the chain, neither releasing it nor backing away. The breathing on the other side of the door grew slightly louder, as if whoever was there had pressed their face close to the wood, just as I had done with mine. "What do you want?" I whispered. The breathing stopped instantly, and for a moment, even the knocking ceased. In that sudden silence, I heard my own heartbeat, fast and irregular, and realized how long I had been standing there, synchronized with the mysterious visitor's rhythm. Then softly, almost inaudibly, came a voice. "Let me in." It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply a voice, speaking words that seemed to come from very far away. For though the breathing had suggested someone pressed right against the door, the words didn't seem to travel through the air, but appeared directly in my mind, like a thought that wasn't my own. The knocking resumed, but now it was faster, more insistent. The same 3-tap pattern, but compressed, urgent. The breathing became audible again, quicker now, excited. My hand tightened on the chain, and I realized with horror that I wanted to let them in. Whatever was outside that door, I wanted to see it, to know what had been calling to me with such patience and persistence. "Let me in." The voice came again, clearer this time. "It's cold out here." I looked through the peephole once more and saw that the darkness had changed. It was no longer the absolute black of before, but something that shifted and moved, like smoke or fog. Within that shifting gray, I thought I could make out the suggestion of a face pale, indistinct, but definitely human in its basic structure. The chain felt warm under my fingers, as if heated by some internal energy. The metal seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the knocking, and I found it increasingly difficult to maintain my grip. My hand wanted to slide along to the latch to pull the chain free and swing the door open. The urge was becoming overwhelming, like the need to scratch an itch or take a breath after holding it too long. "Just for a moment," the voice whispered. "I won't stay long." The clock on the bedside table showed 2:30 a.m., but the numbers seemed wrong somehow. Time felt distorted, stretched thin like taffy. I might have been standing at the door for minutes or hours. The knocking had become so much a part of the night's rhythm that I couldn't imagine it ever stopping. Through the peephole, the shifting darkness began to coalesce into more definite shapes. I could see what might have been hands pressed against the glass, a pale fingers splayed wide. A face hovered just behind them, features obscured by shadow, but eyes that reflected what little light existed in the darkness between the motel units. Those eyes were patient, infinitely patient, but also hungry. They had the look of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and was prepared to wait much longer still. They seemed to know something about me that I didn't know myself, some secret desire or need that only they could fulfill. The door began to feel less like a barrier and more like an obstacle, something arbitrary that separated me from where I really belonged. The chain seemed unreasonably heavy, requiring more effort to hold than to release. My breathing had completely synchronized with the pattern from outside now. 3 short inhales during the knocks, a held breath during the pause, 3 exhales before the cycle repeated. "You're lonely," the voice observed, and I realized it was true. I had been lonely for so long that I'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a constant ache. I'm lonely too. The pale hands pressed more firmly against the peephole, and I could see they were small, delicate, like a child's hands, but somehow wrong. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at angles that suggested bones that weren't quite human. But they moved with such gentleness, such longing, that I found them beautiful rather than frightening. I was no longer holding the chain to keep it closed, but to prevent my own hand from opening it without conscious thought. My body seemed to have decided independently that the door should be opened, that whatever waited outside should be welcomed in. Only my conscious mind held back, clinging to some distant instinct for self-preservation. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, and this time it sounded like my own voice, spoken from outside the door. "Let me in, and I'll tell you who you really are." The clock showed 300 a.m., then 3:30, then 4000. Dawn was still hours away, but I had the sense that sunrise would change nothing. Whatever was outside existed in a space between day and night, between the normal world and something else entirely. It had chosen this place, this room, this moment, but it would wait as long as necessary for me to make the choice it knew I would eventually make. The knocking gradually grew softer, not fading away but becoming more intimate, like a secret being shared. The rhythm remained constant, but now it felt like a heartbeat, slow and steady and infinitely comforting. My own heart began to beat in time with it, and for the first time in hours, I felt truly calm. Outside, the darkness beyond the peephole began to lighten, not with dawn, but with some other illumination. I could see the visitor more clearly now, a figure of indeterminate age and gender, dressed in clothes that seemed to shift and change as I watched. Sometimes modern, sometimes ancient, sometimes no clothing at all, just pale skin that glowed with its own soft light. The face was kind, patient, understanding. It was the face of everyone I had ever loved and lost. Everyone who had ever loved me, everyone I had ever wanted to know but never met. It changed constantly, showing me aspects of people from my past, my future, my dreams, but always with those same patient, hungry eyes. "I've been waiting so long," the voice said, and now it sounded like every voice I had ever longed to hear again. "We don't have to be alone anymore." My hand moved on the chain without conscious direction, sliding along the metal toward the latch. Of the motion felt inevitable, like water finding its way downhill. I had been fighting against something as natural and irresistible as gravity itself. The knocking stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, ragged and quick. The absence of that steady rhythm left me feeling unanchored, as if I had been depending on it to maintain some essential connection to reality. I pressed my ear to the door, desperate to hear some sign that my visitor hadn't abandoned me. "Are you still there?" I whispered. The answer came not as sound, but as a presence, warm and comforting, pressing against the other side of the door. I could feel patient affection radiating through the wood, unconditional acceptance, the promise of an end to all loneliness and uncertainty. My fingers found the latch. The chain slid free with a soft metallic whisper, and I heard the door handle turn from the outside. Cool air flowed into the room, carrying scents of rain and earth, and something else, something sweet and welcoming, like the smell of home after a long journey. I stepped back as the door swung slowly open, revealing not the parking lot beyond, but a soft, gray space that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. My visitor stood silhouetted in that gentle twilight, arms open in welcome, face bright with joy at our long-awaited reunion. "There you are," they said in a voice like music, like memory, like every word I had ever wanted to hear. "I knew you'd let me in eventually." I stepped forward, crossing the threshold between the motel room and whatever lay beyond. Behind me, the Sleepy Pine Motel continued its quiet existence. Room 7 empty once again, ready for the next traveler who might need a place to spend the night. The door closed softly, and the only sound was the gentle rhythm of rain that had begun to fall again, tapping against the windows in a pattern of 3, pause, 3, pause. Like a patient knock that would wait forever for the right person to answer. Story 7. The old university library had always been my sanctuary. 3 floors of leather, bound volumes and dust-moted sunbeams, where the only sounds were the soft whisper of turning pages and the distant hum of the ventilation system. I'd spent countless evenings here during my graduate studies, often staying until the building's automated lights began their slow dimming sequence at closing time. Tonight was different, though I couldn't say why. I'd claimed my usual corner table on the second floor, surrounded by towering stacks of philosophy, texts for my thesis on phenomenology and perception. The familiar weight of Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception rested in my hands, its pages yellowed with age and countless readings. As I turned each page, I fell into the hypnotic rhythm that had always comforted me. The soft rustle of paper, the faint creak of the binding, the gentle thud as each page settled against its predecessor. But something was moving in my peripheral vision. At first, I dismissed it as fatigue. Graduate school had a way of playing tricks on your eyes after long hours of reading dense philosophical texts. The shadows cast by the tall bookshelf beside my table seemed to shift slightly each time I turned a page. But shadows do that, don't they? They respond to changes in light, to the subtle movements of objects that cast them. I turned another page. The shadow definitely moved. Not the natural sway of a shadow responding to light. This was something else. A deliberate shift, as if the darkness itself had decided to relocate. I looked up from my book, scanning the immediate area. The reading lamps cast their pools of warm light exactly as they had for years. The books stood in their orderly rows, spine after spine creating the familiar geometry of knowledge. Nothing had changed. But when I returned my attention to Merlot, Ponty's exploration of embodied perception, the shadow moved again. This time I kept my eyes on the page, but focused my attention on the darkness at the edge of my vision. The text blurred slightly as I divided my concentration, but I could feel something shifting in the space beside me. The shadow wasn't just moving. It was moving in response to my reading. Each time my fingers grasped the corner of a page, the darkness would slide a little to the left. When I released the page and let it fall, the shadow would drift back to the right. The words on the page began to swim before my eyes. Y must recognize the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon, not merely the result of some limitation of our knowledge. How fitting. Merlot. Ponty seemed to be speaking directly to this moment. This uncertainty between what I was seeing and what I knew to be possible. I turned the page more slowly this time, watching the shadow with my peripheral vision while pretending to read. Yes, there it was. A smooth, liquid movement that corresponded perfectly to the arc of the turning page. But shadows don't work that way. They're projections, not independent entities. They can't move unless the objects casting them move, or unless the light source shifts. Neither was happening. The realization sent a small chill through my chest. That peculiar tightness that comes when the rational mind encounters something it cannot easily categorize. I set the book down and turned to face the shadow directly. It stopped moving. In fact, it looked perfectly normal. Just the expected dark space created by the intersection of the bookshelf and the reading lamp's illumination. I studied its edges, looking for anything unusual. The shadow had the correct depth and angle. It responded appropriately when I waved my hand through its space, breaking the light and creating the smaller shadows of my fingers. I picked up the book again and resumed reading. The thing is inseparable from a person perceiving it, and can never be actually in itself, because its articulations are those of our very existence. The shadow began moving again. This time I didn't look up. I continued reading while the darkness performed its impossible dance. Page after page, the shadow kept pace with my reading rhythm. When I paused to consider a particularly complex passage, it paused too. When I flipped several pages quickly to find a cross-reference, it accelerated its movement to match. The relationship felt almost conversational, as if the shadow were reading along with me. The thought should have been absurd, but sitting there in the gradually dimming library, it began to feel natural, companionable even. I started reading aloud, my voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing other late-night scholars. The body is our general medium for having a world. My words created a soft echo in the space between the tall shelves, and the shadow seemed to settle into a more comfortable position, like a person leaning back in their chair to listen. Hours passed this way, or perhaps it was minutes. Time had taken on the fluid quality that comes with deep concentration and stranger experiences. I read about the phenomenology of perception while being acutely aware that my own perception had shifted into something unprecedented. The shadow wasn't just moving now, it was participating. When I reached a passage about the intertwining of seer and seen, the shadow began to darken, becoming more solid and defined. When I read about the reversibility of touch, how touching something is also being touched by it, the shadow seemed to reach toward me. though it never quite bridged the gap between its space and mine. The library's automated system began its closing sequence. Lights in distant sections clicked off one by one, creating a gradual progression of darkness moving through the building like a slow wave. Soon, only my reading area and a few other scattered islands of illumination remained. I should have left then. The logical part of my mind, the part trained in academic rigor and empirical observation, insisted that I gather my materials and head home. But the philosopher in me, the part drawn to questions at the edges of understanding, wanted to see what would happen when the lights went out completely. The shadow seemed to sense my hesitation. It began to move more actively, creating complex patterns that reminded me of sign language, or perhaps some form of writing in a script I couldn't quite decipher. The movements were fluid, continuous, like cursive letters written in darkness. I closed my eyes and listened to the library's nighttime sounds. The ventilation system hummed its constant note. Somewhere in the distance, a book fell from a stack, creating a soft thump. The building structure settled with tiny creaks and sighs. And underneath it all, I could swear I heard something else. A sound like pages turning, but rhythmic, purposeful, as if someone were reading along with me, even though I was alone. When I opened my eyes, my reading lamp flickered once, twice, then dimmed to half its normal brightness. In the reduced light, the shadow had changed. It was larger now, more complex in its shape. Instead of the simple angular darkness cast by the bookshelf, it had acquired curves and depth. Almost like the silhouette of a person, sitting just out of sight. I reached for my book with trembling fingers and read the first sentence my eyes found. We are in the world through our body. My voice cracked slightly on the words, and the shadow seemed to nod. An impossible gesture for a projection of light and darkness. The remaining lights in my section began to dim according to their programming. Within minutes, I would be sitting in complete darkness. The thought terrified and excited me in equal measure. What would happen to the shadow when there was no light to cast it? Would it disappear? He proving this had all been an elaborate trick of perception and fatigue. Or would it reveal itself as something that existed independently of the optical laws I thought I understood? I packed my materials slowly, giving myself time to observe the shadow's behavior as my actions changed. When I stacked my notebooks, it seemed to mirror the gesture, creating the impression of papers being organized in its dark space. When I capped my pen, it made a similar small motion, as if completing the same task. The final reading lamp in my area began its dimming sequence. I had perhaps 30 seconds before total darkness. I stood, shouldering my backpack, and spoke to the shadow directly for the first time. Will I see you tomorrow? In the last seconds of light, as the lamp faded to black, the shadow moved in what could only be described as a wave. The next evening, I returned to the same table. The shadow was waiting for me, motionless until I opened my book. As I began to read, it began its dance again, moving in perfect synchronization with my turning pages. But now I noticed other shadows in the library behaving strangely too. The darkness cast by other reading lamps seemed more animated, more purposeful in its positioning. And in the spaces between the bookshelves, shapes that might have been shadows, or might have been something else, entirely lingered, just beyond the edge of clear vision. I've been coming to this library every evening for 3 weeks now. My thesis has made remarkable progress. I've never understood the relationship between perceiver and perceived with such clarity. The shadow continues to read with me, its movements now so familiar that I feel I could predict them. Sometimes I turn pages just to watch it dance. Last night, I thought I saw words written in the darkness. Not letters, exactly, but patterns of light and shadow that seemed to carry meaning. They appeared for just a moment when I looked directly at my reading companion, then dissolved back into ordinary darkness when I tried to focus on them. I've started bringing different books, testing whether the shadow responds differently to various texts. Philosophy makes it move in smooth, continuous patterns. Poetry creates sharp, angular gestures. Mathematics generates precise geometric shifts. Tonight I plan to bring a mirror. The rational part of my mind insists that I'm experiencing some form of stress-induced hallucination, that the long hours and academic pressure have created a perceptual disturbance that will resolve itself with rest and perspective. But the philosopher in me wonders if Ponty was right about the inseparable connection between perceiver and perceived. What does it mean when the perceived begins to perceive back? I arrive at the library as the evening shift takes over from the day staff. My usual table waits for me, lamp already illuminated, casting its familiar shadow against the bookshelf. I settle into my chair and place tonight's selection, a collection of George Louis Borges stories, on the table beside a small hand mirror. As I open to the Library of Babel, the shadow begins its dance. But tonight, something is different. Instead of simply mirroring my movements, it seems to be leading them. I find myself turning pages at a rhythm that matches its gestures rather than my natural reading speed. In the mirror's reflection, I see my own shadow cast against the opposite wall. It looks normal, behaving exactly as physics would predict. But when I angle the mirror toward my reading companion, it shows only empty space, where I know the moving shadow to be. The mirror reflects everything else accurately. The books, the table, even the reading lamp. But the shadow that dances in response to my reading casts no reflection. It exists in my direct perception, but not in the mirror's representation of the same space. I set the mirror aside and continue reading Borges' infinite library, where every possible book exists somewhere in the endless hexagonal rooms. As I read about the librarians searching for meaning in the vast collection of books, my shadow companion grows more agitated, moving in quick, urgent patterns. The library lights begin their closing sequence, but I don't pack up to leave. Instead, I close my eyes and listen to the sounds of the building preparing for night. The ventilation system, the settling structure, the distant echo of the security guard's footsteps, and underneath it all, growing clearer as the external sounds fade, I hear what I've been hearing all along, but couldn't quite acknowledge, the soft whisper of pages turning, keeping perfect time with my own reading, but coming from a source I cannot identify. When I open my eyes, the last light is fading, and my shadow companion is reaching toward me across the impossible gap between its space and mine. In the final moment before darkness, I reach back. Our shadows touch, and in that instant of contact, I understand that I am not alone in this library, and perhaps I never have been. The boundary between reader and read, between perceiver and perceived, has become as fluid as the shadows that dance between the shelves. In the complete darkness, I hear the sound of many pages turning, and I wonder if tomorrow night, when I return to my table, I will cast a shadow at all. Story 8. The 47 bus runs every 23 minutes after midnight, carving its path through the skeleton of the sleeping city like a metal ghost carrying the displaced and the desperate. I've been riding it for 3 weeks now, ever since my job at the hospital switched me to the graveyard shift, and I thought I understood its rhythms. The hollow echo of the automated announcements. The fluorescent flicker that makes everyone look like they're dying. The particular smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with exhaustion, and the dreams of people who work while others sleep. But tonight, something was different. I waited at the stop on Meridian Avenue, under the streetlight that buzzed like an angry insect. The air carried the October chill that gets into your bones and stays there, reminding you that winter is always closer than you think. My breath made small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air, and I checked my phone for the 4th time, 12:17 a.m. The bus should arrive in 6 minutes, give or take the usual delays. When the headlights cut through the darkness, I felt the familiar relief of not having to wait another 23 minutes in the cold. The bus wheezed to a stop with its characteristic hydraulic sigh, and the doors folded open like mechanical wings. The driver nodded at me, the same slight acknowledgement I'd received for weeks, and I dropped my fare into the machine that counted coins with metallic clicks. That's when I noticed them. Every seat held a passenger, which was unusual for the night route. During my previous rides, I'd shared the space with maybe half a dozen people. Hospital workers like myself, late shift cleaners, the occasional insomniac seeking motion as a cure for sleeplessness. But tonight, the bus was full, and they were all smiling. Not just smiling, wearing the exact same smile. Lips curved in identical arcs, eyes crinkled at precisely the same angles, cheek muscles pulled into configurations that spoke of joy but felt like mathematics. Perfect. Symmetrical expressions that belonged in a manual for aspiring actors rather than on the faces of people riding public transportation at midnight. I found an empty seat near the middle of the bus, settling into the worn vinyl that had been shaped by countless bodies before mine. The fabric was warm, though the bus itself felt cold, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the engine working against gravity and inertia. But underneath the mechanical noise, something else hummed, a frequency just below hearing that made my teeth ache. The passenger across from me was a woman in her 50s, wearing a nurse's scrubs similar to mine. Her smile was painted on with the kind of precision that suggested practice, lots of practice. Her eyes remained fixed forward, not quite focused on anything, and her hands rested palm, down on her thighs with fingers splayed at angles that looked uncomfortable. When the bus hit a pothole, her body absorbed the shock without any change in expression. I tried to catch the eye of the passenger next to me, a young man in a security guard uniform, his smile equally perfect and equally wrong. But his gaze remained locked straight ahead, and when I whispered, "Excuse me," he didn't respond. None of them did. They sat in their seats like mannequins, arranged by someone with a very specific vision of what contentment should look like. The bus announcements continued their recorded loop. Next stop, Oak Street. Oak Street, next stop. But as we passed familiar landmarks, I began to realize we weren't following the usual route. We turned left where we should have gone straight, continued past stops that should have triggered the automated voice. The city beyond the windows looked like the one I knew, but the streets were arranged in patterns that didn't quite match my memory. I pulled the cord to signal a stop, hearing the familiar ding echo through the cabin. But the bus didn't slow. The driver sat behind his protective barrier, hands gripping the wheel, and I could see the edge of his profile reflected in the wide rearview mirror. He was smiling too, the same mechanical expression as all the others. "Excuse me," I called out louder this time. "I'd like to get off at the next stop." No response. The other passengers continued to stare forward with their painted joy. And the bus continued its journey through streets that grew less familiar with each passing block. The buildings outside were the right height, the right general shape, but details had shifted. Windows were spaced differently. Street signs bore names I didn't recognize. Traffic lights hung at intersections that shouldn't exist. I felt the first flutter of genuine fear, a moth beating its wings inside my chest. I stood up, gripping the metal pole for balance, as the bus swayed around a corner that felt too sharp. "I need to get off," I announced to the cabin full of smiling faces. "This isn't my stop." One by one, they turned to look at me. Their smiles never wavered, but their heads rotated with mechanical precision, like flowers following the sun. Eyes that had been staring forward now fixed on me with an attention that felt physical, pressing against my skin with the weight of judgment or hunger, or something I didn't want to name. The humming underneath the engine noise grew louder, and I realized it might be coming from them, a collective vibration that resonated in their chests like the purr of some enormous cat. "Please," I said, and my voice sounded smaller than I intended. "I just want to go home." The woman in scrubs tilted her head, and when she spoke, her voice was my voice, exactly my pitch, my inflection, my particular way of pronouncing vowels. "But this is the way home," she said, and her lips moved while her smile remained intact. "This has always been the way home." The young man in the security uniform nodded, and when he spoke, his voice was also mine. "You've been riding this road for weeks. Every night, same time, same seat. Don't you remember?" Other voices joined in, all variations of my own. The hospital shift, the night route, the same passengers, the same smiles, the same journey that never quite arrives. I backed toward the rear of the bus, but the aisle seemed to stretch longer with each step. The passengers' heads followed my movement with awe, like precision, their smiles growing wider, showing teeth that were too white and too uniform. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, casting strobing shadows that made everything look like a film running at the wrong speed. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to. "Understanding isn't required," said a chorus of my voice from a dozen throats. "Only participation." The bus turned another impossible corner, and through the windows, I saw we were passing the same street corner for the third time. The same building with the broken neon sign, the same empty parking lot, the same fire hydrant that leaned at a tired angle. We were traveling in a loop, and had been traveling in a loop, and would continue traveling in a loop until something fundamental shifted in the mathematics of our motion. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but when I looked at the screen, it showed no signal and a time that read 12:17 a.m. The same time I'd checked when waiting for the bus. Either my phone had stopped working, or time had stopped working, or I had stopped working in some essential way that made linear progress impossible. The passengers began to stand up, still wearing their identical smiles, still moving with that mechanical precision. They filled the aisle, surrounding me with bodies that smelled like antiseptic and artificial vanilla, and something underneath that might have been decay or might have been fear. Their hands reached out, not grabbing but gesturing, encouraging me to join some dance I didn't know the steps to. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Because you're afraid," said my voice from the mouth of an elderly man in a janitor's uniform. "Because you ride the night bus every evening, counting the minutes until you can get off and pretend you're somewhere else. Because you smile at patients all day and come home empty," said my voice from a teenager with painted nails. "Because you practice contentment in the mirror and wonder why it never feels real. Because this is what you think happiness looks like," said my voice from the bus driver, who had turned around in his seat to face me. Perfect uniform, requiring no effort or risk or genuine emotion. They were right, of course. I'd been practicing that same smile for months, putting it on with my scrubs each morning, wearing it through 12-hour shifts of other people's pain and fear and hope. I'd perfected the expression of someone who had her life together, who wasn't struggling with debt and loneliness and the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for people who might not survive their own vulnerability. The bus slowed finally, coming to a stop at a corner I recognized. My corner where I caught the 47 every night at 12:40 a.m. The doors opened with their familiar hydraulic wheeze, and cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of autumn and the possibility of escape. But as I moved toward the exit, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I was smiling the same perfect smile as all the others, lips curved in that practiced arc of contentment that felt like wearing a mask made of my own face. "Will I remember this tomorrow?" I asked. "You'll remember what you need to remember," said my voice from everywhere and nowhere. "You'll catch the bus at 12:40, same as always. You'll practice your smile in the window's reflection. You'll wonder why you feel like you're going in circles." I stepped down from the bus, feeling the solid reality of concrete under my feet. Behind me, the doors closed, and the 47 continued its route through streets that might lead somewhere or might lead nowhere, carrying passengers who had learned to wear their joy like uniforms. As I walked home, I found myself humming that frequency I'd heard on the bus, a tune that lived just below the threshold of conscious recognition. My reflection in storefront windows showed that practiced smile, and I wondered if I'd been wearing it longer than I realized. If maybe I'd been riding the night route for years, getting on and off at the same stops, following the same loop, believing I was going somewhere while traveling in perfect circles. The key turned in my apartment lock with a familiar click, and I climbed the stairs that led to rooms arranged exactly as I'd left them. But as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow night, when I waited at the bus stop on Meridian Avenue, I'd check my phone at 12:17 and count the minutes until the next loop began. And maybe, just maybe, I'd be smiling about it. Story 9. I discovered Miller's Pond on a Sunday morning in late September, when the air carried that particular crispness that makes you believe in fresh starts and the possibility of becoming someone new. I'd been driving aimlessly, trying to escape the weight of another sleepless night, and the apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. The GPS on my phone had died somewhere outside town, leaving me to navigate by instinct and the kind of desperate hope that sometimes masquerades as adventure. The dirt road wound through stands of birch and maple just beginning their autumn transformation, leaves holding on to green but whispering promises of gold and crimson to come. I almost missed the turnoff, just a break in the trees marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Miller's Pond, in letters nearly faded to invisibility. Something about the hidden quality of it appealed to me, the idea of a place that didn't advertise itself to passing strangers. The parking area was little more than a cleared space where gravel met grass, empty except for the settling dust of my arrival. A narrow trail led through the trees, marked by the kind of worn path that comes from years of steady use rather than official maintenance. I locked the car, though I couldn't say why, force of habit, perhaps, or the city dweller's inability to fully trust in solitude. The path opened onto a scene that belonged in a postcard advertising the simple pleasures of rural life. Miller's Pond stretched before me, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by cattails and the kind of weathered dock that suggested generations of quiet fishing and teenage first kisses. The water was darker than I'd expected, holding the overcast sky like a mirror framed in bronze. Perfectly still, perfectly quiet, except for the occasional plop of a fish jumping or a frog announcing its presence to the world. I walked to the end of the dock, my footsteps echoing hollow on the sun-bleached planks. The wood was warm beneath my hands as I knelt and peered into the water. My reflection looked back, wavering slightly with the motion of my breathing, but clear enough that I could see. Exhaustion I'd been carrying in the dark circles under my eyes, the way my shoulders curved inward as if protecting something fragile. But as the water settled into perfect stillness, I noticed something that made me lean closer. The face looking back at me was mine, certainly same nose, same scar on my left eyebrow from a childhood accident, same unruly hair that never quite cooperated with brushes or styling products. But there was something in the expression that didn't match what I was feeling. The reflection wore a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in months, a contentment that sat in the curve of the mouth and the relaxation of the forehead. I touched my own face, watching my reflection mirror the movement. Everything matched perfectly: the angle of my hand, the timing of the gesture, the way my fingers traced the familiar topography of cheek and jaw. But that expression of peace remained, as if my reflection had access to some inner state I'd forgotten how to reach. The morning stretched into afternoon as I sat on the dock, dangling my feet in water that was warmer than the air. Occasionally, other visitors would arrive, an elderly couple with folding chairs and a thermos of coffee, a young father teaching his daughter to skip stones, a woman about my age who nodded politely as she passed with her golden retriever. But mostly, I was alone with the pond and the reflection that seemed more at ease with solitude than I was. I returned the following weekend, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. The same hidden road, the same weathered sign, the same sense of discovering a secret that had been waiting for me to find it. But this time, when I knelt at the edge of the dock and looked into the water, my reflection was smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile I wore for coworkers and cashiers, but something genuine and spontaneous, the kind of expression that comes from unexpected joy. I wasn't smiling, I was sure of that. I could feel my mouth set in its usual neutral line, maybe even turned slightly downward with the concentration of trying to understand what I was seeing. But my reflection beamed back at me with unmistakable happiness. I experimented, deliberately frowning, pursing my lips, even sticking out my tongue. Each gesture was mirrored perfectly in the water, but underneath whatever expression I made, that smile persisted like a watermark on expensive paper, as if my reflection had found reasons for contentment that my actual self hadn't yet discovered. Over the following weeks, Miller's Pond became a regular destination, a pilgrimage I made every Saturday morning without quite admitting to myself why. I told people I'd found a nice place to read, to think, to get away from the noise of the city. All true enough, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was visiting someone, the version of myself who lived in the water, and seemed to understand something about happiness that I'd forgotten. The reflection began to change in other ways. Small differences at first, the posture straighter, the eyes brighter, a general sense of vitality that contrasted sharply with how I felt in my own skin. My reflected self looked like someone who slept well, who ate regular meals, who had hobbies and friendships and reasons to get out of bed each morning that went beyond mere obligation. I started bringing things to the pond, a book, a sketch pad, sandwiches that I'd eat while sitting cross-legged on the dock. Each time I looked into the water, my reflection would be engaged with these activities in ways that felt more authentic than my actual experience. When I read reflection, me looked absorbed and delighted rather than merely passing time. When I attempted to sketch the landscape, reflection, me's drawings seemed to flow with an artistic confidence I'd never possessed. Other people began to comment on changes they noticed in me. My neighbor mentioned that I seemed lighter somehow. A coworker asked if I'd started taking vitamins or seeing a therapist. My sister, during one of our increasingly rare phone calls, said I sounded more like myself than I had in years. But I didn't feel different, if anything. The growing gap between who I was and who I appeared to be in the water made me feel more fragmented, more uncertain about which version was real. The first Saturday in November brought an early frost that turned the cattails brittle and left a thin skin of ice along the pond's edges. I had to break through the surface with a stick to see my reflection clearly, and what I saw made me stumble backward on the dock. The face in the water wasn't just happier or more peaceful, it was younger. Not dramatically so, but enough that I could see the person I'd been 5 years ago, before the job that slowly ground me down, before the relationship that ended in mutual exhaustion, before I'd learned to expect disappointment as the most likely outcome of hope. I reached out to touch the water, and my reflection reached up to meet me. Our fingers should have met at the surface, but instead, I felt something else entirely. Not the shock of cold water, but the warmth of another person's hand. The pressure of fingers interlacing with mine in a grip that felt like coming home. "Who are you?" I whispered to the water. The reflection's mouth moved, but I heard the words inside my own head rather than through my ears. "I'm who you could be. Who you were before you forgot. I don't understand. You come here every week and sit with me, but you never really see me. You see what you think you've lost, what you think you can't have again. But I'm not separate from you. I'm the part of you that never gave up, that kept growing while you were busy surviving." The hand holding mine felt real, more real than the wooden dock beneath my knees or the November air against my cheek. How do I become you? You already are me. You just need to stop believing that you're not. The reflection began to change as we spoke, not younger now, but somehow more integrated, as if the various pieces of identity were settling into their proper places. The peace was still there, but it no longer looked foreign. The happiness remained, but it felt earned rather than mysterious. The vitality glowed from within rather than seeming like something observed from the outside. "What happens now?" I asked. "You stop visiting me and start visiting yourself. You stop looking for answers in the water and start finding them in the mirror. You stop waiting for permission to be happy and start practicing it like any other skill." As the reflection spoke, I began to feel the changes in my own body. The loosening of muscles I didn't realize had been clenched. The deepening of breath I hadn't noticed had become shallow. The lifting of weight from shoulders that had carried burdens I'd forgotten I could set down. When I finally looked away from the water and back at the world around the pond, everything seemed more vivid. The bare branches of the trees held a stark beauty that spoke of resilience rather than loss. The cold air carried scents of wood smoke and possibility. Even the sound of distant traffic became part of a symphony rather than mere noise. I stood up slowly, my reflection rising with me, and for the first time in months, we moved in perfect synchronization. Not because we were mirror images, but because we were finally the same person. The drive home felt different. Not the aimless wandering that had brought me to the pond originally, but a purposeful return to a life that was waiting for me to inhabit it fully. The apartment looked the same when I unlocked the door, but it felt like a place where someone lived, rather than merely existed. I haven't been back to Miller's Pond since that November morning. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't need to. The person I was visiting there doesn't live in the water anymore. She lives here, in this skin, in this life, in these daily choices to believe that contentment is not only possible, but inevitable. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in unexpected places, store windows, bathroom mirrors, the black screen of my phone, I see traces of that pond, self-looking back. The smile that starts from within. The posture that suggests someone comfortable in her own body. The eyes that hold secrets worth keeping rather than burdens too heavy to carry. And sometimes, on very still mornings, when the light hits the coffee in my mug just right, I can see her there too, reminding me that the person I was looking for was never lost. She was just waiting, patient as water. He for me to remember how to recognize my own reflection. Story 10. The first alarm started at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, piercing the October night with the kind of electronic shriek that turns sleep into a distant memory. I lay in bed, listening to the familiar rhythm of a car alarm cycling through its programmed sequence, the honking horn. The whoop, whoop, whoop of the siren, the computerized voice that announced, protected by Viper, to anyone within a 3-block radius. Standard urban inconvenience, the kind of minor crisis that city dwellers learn to absorb into their dreams. But this alarm didn't stop after the usual 5 minutes. It continued its mechanical tantrum as I counted ceiling tiles and tried various combinations of pillows over my head. At 3:45, I gave up on sleep and stumbled to my apartment window, peering down into the parking lot of the complex across the street. The lot was bathed in orange sodium light, shadows cutting sharp angles between rows of vehicles. I could see the source of the noise, a white sedan parked in the middle section, hazard lights blinking in frantic synchronization with its electronic screaming. What I couldn't see was any sign of disturbance. No broken glass. No suspicious figures. No apparent reason for the car to believe it was under attack. By 4 a.m., the sound had become a living thing inside my skull, each cycle of the alarm feeling like fingernails on the soft tissues of my brain. I pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, grabbed my keys, and headed downstairs to investigate. Someone needed to do something, and the building's security office had been temporarily closed for the past 6 months. The cool air outside carried the full force of the alarm, amplified by the concrete surfaces of the surrounding buildings. As I approached the white sedan, I could see my reflection multiplied in its windows, a tired figure in rumpled clothes, moving like someone walking underwater. The car appeared undamaged, sitting perfectly level on properly inflated tires, no signs of tampering with doors or windows. I walked around the vehicle, looking for some obvious trigger that might explain its distress. Nothing. The car was pristine, almost showroom clean despite its apparent age. Through the windows, I could see an interior that looked unused, no coffee cups in the holders, no papers on the dashboard, no evidence that anyone had ever sat in those fabric seats. That's when I heard it underneath the electronic screaming, a sound that didn't belong in the mechanical symphony of a car alarm. It was faint, almost overwhelmed by the primary noise, but unmistakably human. A voice calling for help. I pressed my ear against the driver's side window, straining to isolate the sound. There it was again, muffled but desperate, like someone shouting from inside a sealed room. The voice seemed to be coming from inside the car, though I could clearly see the empty interior through the glass. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish but unable to ignore what I was hearing. "I's someone in there." The car alarm continued its cycle, but underneath it, the voice became more distinct. It was a woman's voice, hoarse from what sounded like hours of calling out. "Please," she was saying. "Please help me. I can't get out. I can't get out." I tried the door handles, expecting them to be locked, but the driver's door opened easily. The alarm's volume doubled as the car's interior was exposed to the night air, but I could hear the voice more clearly now. It was coming from the speakers, or rather, it was coming through the speakers, as if someone were trapped inside the car's electrical system itself. "Where are you?" I shouted over the noise. "I don't know," came the reply, crackling through the car's audio system with the distortion of a bad phone connection. I was driving home from work. Late shift at the hospital. I remember stopping at a red light, and then I was here. Wherever here is. I slumped into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I was experiencing. The dashboard glowed with normal indicator lights, and when I turned the key that was still in the ignition, the engine started smoothly. But the voice continued, and the alarm kept screaming, and nothing about the situation made sense according to any logic I understood. "What's your name?" I asked. "Sarah. Sarah Chen. I'm a nurse at St. Mary's. Please, you have to help me. I've been calling for hours. I knew St. Mary's. It was 3 miles away. A road that passed directly through this neighborhood. Sarah, I'm going to try to help you, but I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me what you see where you are?" It's dark. So dark and cold. I can hear my own voice echoing, like I'm in a tunnel or a cave. Sometimes I see lights passing by, but they're far away. And there are other voices, calling out. They sound scared. As if summoned by her words, other car alarms began to sound across the parking lot. Not all at once, but in a cascading sequence, as if some signal were moving from vehicle to vehicle. Within minutes, a dozen cars were adding their electronic voices to the growing symphony of distress. I got out of the white sedan and moved through the lot, the cacophony washing over me in waves. Each car I approached revealed the same pattern, pristine exterior, empty interior visible through the windows, but voices coming through the audio systems. Different voices, different stories, but all variations on the same impossible theme. A red SUV held the voice of Marcus, a security guard who remembered leaving work at 2 a.m. and nothing else. A blue compact car contained Alina, a teacher who'd been driving home after parent-teacher conferences. An old pickup truck carried the desperate pleas of David, a postal worker who'd finished his route and was heading home to his family. All of them trapped somewhere between their last clear memory and wherever their voices now existed. All of them calling for help through car alarms that screamed their electronic distress into the October night. "This can't be real," I said aloud, but the voices heard me. "Please don't leave." Sarah's voice crackled from the white sedan. "You're the first person who's been able to hear us." "How long have you been?" "Wherever you are." "I don't know. Time feels different here. It could be hours or days or longer. But I remember the alarm starting. That's how we learn to speak through them. The alarms are like telephone lines between where we are and where our cars are. I walked between the screaming vehicles, listening to fragments of their stories. They were all night shift workers, all people who traveled these streets in the small hours when the city belonged to the desperate and the displaced. All of them had simply vanished between one moment and the next, leaving behind only their vehicles and their voices. "Where do you think you are?" I asked the collective chorus. "Somewhere else," said Marcus from the SUV. "Somewhere that looks like the roads we know, but wrong. The streets don't lead where they should. The lights never change. And there are things in the shadows that don't want us to find the way out. Things. We can't see them clearly, Elena's voice came from the compact car, but we can feel them watching. Waiting. Sometimes we hear footsteps that don't match any of ours, as if in response to her words. I became aware of movement at the edges of my vision. Nothing definite. Just the suggestion of shapes that retreated whenever I turned to look directly. The parking lot, which had felt empty when I first arrived, now seemed crowded with presences that existed just beyond the reach of the sodium lights. You need to get out of there, Sarah's voice urged from the sedan. They can see you now, because you can hear us, because you've made yourself part of this. I looked around the lot, counting the screaming cars. 13 vehicles, 13 voices. 13 people who had vanished while driving the night routes through this part of the city. And now I was here, standing among their abandoned cars, listening to their impossible voices, feeling the attention of things that existed in the spaces between departure and arrival. "How do I help you?" I asked. "We don't know," came the collective reply. "But maybe you could drive one of our cars. See if you can find where the roads lead when they're not going where they should." The idea terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. But the alternative, leaving these people trapped in their electronic purgatory, felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about human obligation. I approached the white sedan, Sarah's car, and slid back into the driver's seat. "If I do this," I said, "if I try to follow the roads you've been traveling, what happens to my body, to my car?" "Or think it stays behind," Sarah said, like ours did. "But we can't be sure. We can't remember the transition." I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the familiar texture of worn plastic under my palms. The engine hummed at idle, perfectly normal, perfectly mechanical. But when I put the car in reverse and began to back out of the parking space, something fundamental shifted in the quality of the night around me. The other car alarms grew distant, as if I were moving away from them at impossible speed. The lights of the apartment buildings began to blur and stretch, like stars seen from a spacecraft accelerating past the speed of light. And underneath it all, I could hear new voices, not coming through the car speakers, but from the spaces between seconds, the gaps in the continuum where lost travelers gathered to compare maps that led nowhere. "Welcome to the night route," Sarah said, and her voice was clearer now, as if she were sitting in the passenger seat beside me. "Don't worry about finding the way back. Worry about finding the way forward. Because the only exit from here is through." The road ahead stretched into darkness that felt deeper than mere absence of light. In my rearview mirror, I could see the parking lot growing smaller, could see a figure standing among the still, screaming cars, looking lost and confused. A figure that wore my face and my clothes, and probably couldn't understand why he was suddenly standing alone in a parking lot at 4 a.m., listening to car alarms and wondering what he'd been doing there. But I was already too far away to explain, already committed to the journey that would either lead 13 lost souls home or add one more voice to the chorus of electronic screaming that haunted the spaces between sleep and waking in the small hours of the city's dreams. The speedometer read 30 miles per hour, but distance here wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in the space between one heartbeat and the next, between the moment you realize you're lost and the moment you accept that lost might be exactly where you need to be. Ahead, the road curved into questions that had no comfortable answers, and behind, the alarms continued their vigil, calling out to anyone who might be listening that somewhere in the darkness, people were still trying to find their way home. Story 11. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray dawn that makes you question whether night ever truly ended. The brass numbers on my apartment door gleamed dully in the fluorescent hallway light, 247. I'd lived here for 6 months, climbed these same 17 steps every evening, fumbled with my keys at this same door. 247. I knew it like I knew the sound of my own breathing. But Wednesday morning, as I stepped out with my coffee mug warming my palms, the numbers read 251. I stood there, steam curling from my cup into the recycled air of the hallway, and stared. The brass caught the light the same way. The scratches I remembered from moving day were still there, a small gouge near the bottom of the 7. Now the 1. My key had turned in the lock just as smoothly as always. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it, my unmade bed, the dishes in the sink, the book splayed open on page 143, where I'd fallen asleep reading. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken about the original numbers. Memory, after all, is unreliable. We tell ourselves stories about the past, and sometimes those stories shift like sand beneath our feet. Thursday, 238. The brass was warm to the touch, as if someone had been holding it. I pressed my ear against the cool metal door and listened. Inside, the refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. The radiator clicked and sighed. All the sounds of home, filtered through wood and metal and the strange alchemy of belonging. But in the hallway, something else whispered. Not quite a voice, more like the memory of breathing. I turned around, expecting to see Mrs. Chen from across the hall, but the corridor stretched empty in both directions. The carpet bore the same worn path from years of footsteps, the same stains that looked like abstract art if you squinted. Everything normal, everything wrong. I started taking pictures. Each morning, before leaving for work, I'd hold up my phone and capture the numbers. The photos never lied: 238, 219, 263, 244. Always different, always somehow right. The super, when I called, insisted I lived in 247 and always had. His voice carried that particular wariness of someone accustomed to tenants' complaints about noisy neighbors and broken faucets. Not existential crises involving brass numerals. Check your lease, he said. It's right there in black and white. But when I looked at my lease that evening, sitting at my small kitchen table with a takeout container of pad thai growing cold, the document clearly stated, apartment 219. My signature sprawled across the bottom, dated 6 months ago, perfectly normal and perfectly impossible. The walls of my apartment began to feel closer together. Not physically, I measured, and the dimensions never changed. But the space breathed differently now, expanded and contracted with each sunrise. The morning light fell through my windows at angles that seemed wrong, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. I'd watch a shadow creep across the wall, following the path of what should have been a passing cloud, only to glance outside and see clear sky. Nights became exercises in listening. I'd lie in bed, covers pulled to my chin, and catalog every sound. The building settled around me with creaks and sighs, but underneath the familiar noises, something new had taken residence, footsteps in the hallway, but never quite matching the rhythm of any neighbor I knew. A key turning in a lock not mine, but close enough to make me hold my breath. Sometimes, very faintly, the sound of someone moving furniture, scraping across a floor that might have been above me, or below me, or inside the walls themselves. The numbers continued their dance: 276, 251, 230, 269. I started leaving earlier for work, lingering in coffee shops until the morning crowd thinned. Anything to avoid facing my door in the weak light of dawn. But avoidance only sharpened the edge of anticipation. By afternoon, the question would begin its familiar gnaw: what number would greet me tonight? 3 weeks in, I met another resident in the elevator, a woman about my age, carrying a bag of groceries that smelled like onions and fresh bread. She smiled politely, the kind of neutral friendliness that urban living requires. "Which floor?" I asked, finger hovering over the buttons. "Second," she said. 2047. The elevator lurched between floors, and for a moment I felt weightless. 247. Been there about a year now. Great natural light in the mornings. I wanted to tell her about the numbers, about the shifting reality that had become my daily companion. Instead, I pressed the button and watched the floors tick by in perfect, immutable order. When the doors opened, she walked confidently down the hallway that looked exactly like mine, toward a door that bore the numbers I remembered from my first day. That night, I stood in my own hallway for 20 minutes, staring at the door marked 203. The brass numbers seemed to pulse in the fluorescent light, though when I focused directly on them, they remained perfectly still. I reached out and traced the curves and angles with my fingertip. The metal was cold, then warm, then something that wasn't quite temperature at all. Inside, everything waited exactly as I'd left it. My coffee mug sat in the sink, a ring of dried coffee staining the bottom. The book lay open on my nightstand, still on page 143. I'd been trying to finish the same chapter for weeks now, but the words kept rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. Characters changed names mid-sentence. Plot points dissolved and reformed like morning mist. I began to document more than just the numbers. I photographed my apartment each morning and evening, looking for changes. The furniture never moved, but sometimes the shadows fell wrong. My reflection in the bathroom mirror appeared tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. The face looking back at me carried the weight of questions I didn't know how to ask. The numbers accelerated their changes: 188, 291, 25, 244, 276, back to 188. Some days I'd check 3 or 4 times, each glimpse revealing a new configuration. I started questioning whether I was actually leaving the building or simply dreaming my daily routines. Work became a blur of familiar tasks, performed by hands that felt increasingly disconnected from my body. Colleagues spoke to me as if nothing had changed, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. One morning, Thursday or Friday, the days had begun to blur together. I found my door marked 247. The original number, the one I'd lived with for my first few weeks of occupancy. I stood there for a long time, key in hand, wondering if this was some kind of ending. If the numbers had completed their cycle and would now remain constant. But when I turned the key, the apartment beyond was subtly different. The same furniture, the same scuffs on the hardwood floor, the same water stain on the bedroom ceiling. But the light fell at an angle that was almost right, and the air carried a scent I couldn't identify, something like vanilla and dust, and the particular staleness of places that have been empty too long. I called in sick to work. The lie came easily, though I wasn't sure it was entirely false. I felt unmoored, adrift in a space that was mine but not mine, in a time that moved forward, but somehow sideways as well. I spent the day walking through my apartment, touching familiar objects, a coffee table inherited from my grandmother, a lamp bought at a flea market, books whose spines I could recite from memory, and finding them subtly wrong. Not different enough to name, but wrong enough to notice. The woman from the elevator knocked on my door that evening. When I opened it, she stood in the hallway holding a casserole dish, steam escaping from under the foil cover. "Thought you might like some homemade lasagna," she said. Her smile was warm, genuine. "I noticed you've been keeping odd hours lately." Behind her, the hallway stretched in both directions, fluorescent lights humming their familiar tune. The carpet showed the same worn patterns, the same mysterious stains. But something about the geometry felt off, as if the walls weren't quite parallel, or the ceiling pitched at an angle just shy of level. "Thank you," I said, accepting the dish. The ceramic was warm against my palms. "That's very kind." "We neighbors should look out for each other," she said. "By the way, have you been having any trouble with your apartment number?" "Mine keeps changing." I stared at her, the casserole dish growing heavy in my hands. "Changing. Every morning, different numbers. I've lived in 247 for a year, but last week it was 203, then 291, yesterday 188. Building management says there's nothing wrong, but..." She shrugged, a gesture that contained multitudes of uncertainty. "What do you think is happening?" "I think," she said, and her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly in the recycled air, that we might not be living where we think we're living, or maybe we're living exactly where we need to be, and the numbers are trying to tell us something we're not ready to understand. She turned and walked toward the elevator, her footsteps echoing in rhythms that didn't quite match her gait. I watched until she disappeared around the corner, then looked down at the casserole dish. The foil had been folded into precise triangles, and underneath, someone had written in careful script, "For the resident of whichever number you need to be." That night, I didn't check the numbers on my door. I ate the lasagna. It tasted like my grandmother's recipe, though I'd never told anyone how she made it, and went to bed with questions that felt heavier than answers. Outside my window, the city hummed its nighttime lullaby, a sound that was almost familiar, almost home. In the morning, I know the numbers will have changed again. They always do. But for the first time since this began, I find myself curious rather than afraid. Maybe the shifting is the point. Maybe home isn't about staying in the same place, but about learning to recognize yourself in whatever space you wake up in. The brass will be warm to the touch, and the hallway will whisper its secrets. And somewhere in this building that contains more apartments than should fit in its walls, other residents are discovering that the ground beneath their feet is far less solid than they once believed. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly where we need to be. A story 12. I inherited the farmhouse from my great-aunt Constance, along with 43 acres of overgrown fields, and a collection of outbuildings in various stages of decay. The inheritance came as a surprise. I'd met Aunt Constance only a handful of times during family gatherings, and she'd always seemed more interested in her cats than in maintaining relationships with distant relatives. But apparently, I was the only family member willing to take on the property, and she'd left it to me along with a brief note. The old place needs someone who appreciates quiet and isn't afraid of a little mystery. The farmhouse was built in 1847, a solid structure of fieldstone and timber that had weathered more than a century and a half with remarkable grace. Most of the repairs needed were cosmetic: peeling paint, loose shingles, windows that stuck from decades of settling. The bones of the house were sound, and I found something deeply satisfying about restoring it to its original character. I'd been working as a freelance graphic designer for years, spending most of my time in cramped urban apartments with poor natural light and the constant background noise of city life. The prospect of running my business from a peaceful rural setting, with room to breathe and think, felt like a return to something essential I'd lost without realizing it. The well was located about 50 yards behind the house, near what had once been a vegetable garden, but was now a tangle of weeds and volunteer trees. It was an old stone well, perhaps original to the property, with a circular wall that rose about 3 feet above ground level. A wooden cover, weathered gray and secured with a simple latch, protected the opening. During my first week of residence, I'd lifted the cover to assess the well's condition, curious about whether it might still be functional. The stone walls disappeared into darkness deeper than my flashlight beam could penetrate, and when I dropped a small stone into the depths, several seconds passed before I heard the distant splash. The well was deep, probably 40 feet or more, and appeared to contain water. A local contractor had told me that many of the old wells in the area were still viable, fed by underground springs that had flowed unchanged for centuries. I made a mental note to have the water tested, thinking it might be useful for irrigation if I decided to restore the vegetable garden. It was during my 3rd week in the house that I first heard the singing. I'd been working late in my makeshift office, the front parlor, with its large windows and good natural light, when a sound drifted in from outside. At first, I thought it might be a radio from a neighboring property, though the nearest house was more than half a mile away. The sound was faint, melodic, and seemed to be coming from somewhere behind the house. I stepped out onto the back porch to listen more carefully. The night was still and clear, with no wind to carry sounds from distant sources. The singing was definitely coming from the direction of the old well, a female voice performing what sounded like a lullaby or folk song in a minor key. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, with a quality that seemed both ancient and timeless. The words were indistinct. I couldn't make out specific lyrics, but the emotional content was unmistakable. There was longing in the voice, and sadness, but also a kind of patient hope that made the song deeply moving despite its melancholy tone. I walked toward the well, my bare feet silent on the dew-damp grass. As I drew closer, the voice became clearer, though the words remained unintelligible. The singing wasn't coming from ground level. It was rising from somewhere below, echoing up from the depths of the well with a clarity that suggested excellent acoustics. Someone was at the bottom of the well, singing in the darkness 40 feet below ground level. My first instinct was panic. Someone had fallen into the well and was calling for help in the only way they could manage. I ran back to the house to get a flashlight and my phone, already planning the emergency call to local rescue services. But as I returned to the well with my equipment, I realized that the singing didn't sound like someone in distress. The voice was strong, clear, and entirely melodic. There were no breaks for breathing that would suggest someone struggling to stay afloat. No variation in volume that would indicate movement or difficulty maintaining position. I lifted the wooden cover and aimed my flashlight down into the well. The beam illuminated the stone walls and, far below, the dark surface of the water. I could see no one down there, no sign of human presence at all. Yet the singing continued, rising from the depths with perfect clarity. "Hello," I called down. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The singing stopped immediately. I waited, listening to the profound silence that followed. No response, no sound of movement, no indication that anyone had heard my call. After several minutes, I replaced the well cover and returned to the house, convinced that I'd experienced some kind of acoustic illusion. Perhaps the wind through the stone walls creating a sound that my mind had interpreted as singing. But the voice returned the following night, and the night after that. Each time, it was the same beautiful, melancholy melody rising from the depths of the well, sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock. The song seemed to last about 15 minutes, then fade away into silence. And each time I investigated, lifting the cover and calling down, the singing would stop immediately, leaving no trace of its source. I began to research the history of the property, looking for any mention of accidents or tragedies that might be connected to the well. The local historical society had records going back to the farmhouse's construction, and I spent several afternoons in their archive room, poring over old newspapers and property documents. I found nothing about accidents or deaths on the property, but I did discover something interesting about the well itself. According to a survey conducted in 1923, the well was noted as having exceptional acoustic properties due to its depth and stone construction. The surveyor had mentioned that sounds dropped into the well would echo for an unusually long time, and that the circular stone walls created a natural amplification chamber. This information should have provided a rational explanation for what I was experiencing. Sound from some distant source was being channeled and amplified by the well's acoustics, creating the illusion of singing emanating from its depths. But the explanation didn't account for the consistency of the phenomenon. The same time each night, the same duration, the same melody, or the way the sound stopped instantly whenever I investigated. On my 10th night in the house, I decided to conduct a more systematic observation. I set up a folding chair near the well before sunset and prepared to wait for the evening's performance. I brought a digital recorder, hoping to capture evidence that might help me understand what I was experiencing. The night was particularly quiet, with no breeze and no sounds from the surrounding countryside. At 10:23 p.m., the singing began, up close, with no barriers between myself and the source. The voice was extraordinary. The melody was complex, with subtle variations that suggested a sophisticated musical tradition. The singer's technique was flawless. Perfect pitch, exquisite breath control, and an emotional expressiveness that gave me chills. I activated my recorder and sat transfixed, listening to what was undoubtedly the most beautiful singing I'd ever heard. The song seemed to be in multiple movements, flowing from passages of pure melody to sections that incorporated what sounded like harmonized counterpoint, as if multiple voices were joining the primary singer. But when I looked down at my recorder, the device showed no input. The needle remained flat, despite the powerful voice filling the air around me. I checked the settings, adjusted the sensitivity, even tried recording my own voice to ensure the device was functioning properly. Everything worked normally, except when I tried to capture the well song. The singing continued for its usual duration, then faded away. I remained in my chair for another hour, hoping it might return, but the night remained silent. Over the following weeks, I established a ritual around the well song. Each evening, I would finish my work, prepare a cup of tea, and go out to sit by the well to listen. The singing became an anchor point for my days, something I looked forward to with an anticipation that bordered on dependence. The melody never changed, but my understanding of it deepened with each night's listening. I began to hear layers and subtleties that had escaped my initial attention. The way certain phrases repeated with slight variations, the mathematical precision of the harmonic progressions, the emotional journey that unfolded over the course of the song. More intriguingly, I started to feel as though the singing was directed at me specifically. When I sat closer to the well, the voice seemed to gain warmth and intimacy. When I tried listening from the house, the sound remained audible, but lost some of its emotional impact. I began to sing along. At first, just humming the melody under my breath, trying to learn the intricate patterns. But gradually, I found myself adding my own voice to the performance, harmonizing with the unseen singer in ways that felt natural and right. The well singer seemed to respond to my participation. When I managed to match the melody accurately, the voice would sustain certain notes longer, as if acknowledging my contribution. When I added harmonies, the singing would shift to accommodate my additions, creating more complex musical arrangements that neither of us could have produced alone. Our duets became the highlight of my days. I would spend hours during daylight practicing the melody, working out the harmonic progressions, preparing for the evening's collaboration. My neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind. The strange city person who'd inherited the Hartwell place and could be heard singing to herself in the backyard every night. But the connection I felt to the well singer was unlike anything I'd experienced. Through our musical partnership, I felt I was communicating with a consciousness that existed entirely through song, that expressed its deepest thoughts and emotions through melody alone. 3 months into my residency, I made a discovery that changed everything. While cleaning out Aunt Constance's papers from the attic, I found a journal she'd kept during her final years. Most of the entries were mundane: weather observations, notes about her cats, reminders to order heating oil. But scattered throughout were references to the well singer and/or evening concerts. For Aunt Constance had heard the singing too. Her earliest mention dated back more than 20 years. She described the same phenomenon I'd been experiencing. The nightly songs, the impossibility of recording them, the sense of personal connection with the unseen performer. But her entries revealed a progression I was only beginning to understand. Over the years, Aunt Constance had developed an increasingly intimate relationship with the well singer. She'd learned to distinguish different songs for different seasons, had identified patterns that seemed to correspond to lunar cycles, had even begun to interpret the music as a form of communication about weather, local wildlife, and the changing health of the land. The final entry, dated just weeks before her death, read, "She's been teaching me about leaving, about how consciousness can persist in places we love, how attachment to a location can transcend physical presence. I think I understand now why I was never able to move away from this place, never able to sell the property, despite the sensible advice of everyone I knew. This land holds more than any of us realize, and some of us are chosen to be its guardians. That night, I went to the well with new questions. When the singing began, I listened with different ears, trying to detect the teaching that Aunt Constance had described. Instead of simply enjoying the beautiful music, I focused on its deeper layers, its possible meanings, and slowly I began to understand. The well singer wasn't human, hadn't been human for a very long time. The voice belonged to something that existed in the spaces between earth and water, between sound and silence, between the visible world and the mysteries that lay beneath it. She was connected to the land itself, part of its essential nature. And her singing was how she communicated with the rare individuals who were sensitive enough to hear her. Aunt Constance had been one of those individuals. And now, it seemed, I was another. Over the remaining months of that first year, my relationship with the well singer deepened into something I could only describe as a form of mystical friendship. Through our evening concerts, she taught me about the hidden life of the land, the underground streams that fed the well, the seasonal cycles that governed all growing things, the network of connection that linked every living creature in the ecosystem. I learned that the farmhouse had been built on this specific site because of the well, not the other way around. The original settlers had been drawn by the water source, but some of them had also been sensitive to the presence that lived within it. Over the generations, the property had consistently attracted individuals who could hear the well singer, who could benefit from her ancient wisdom. My graphic design business thrived in ways I'd never expected. Working in partnership with the consciousness that inhabited the land, I found my creative vision expanding beyond anything I'd thought possible. My work began to incorporate patterns and harmonies that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, creating designs that had an organic beauty and emotional resonance that my clients found irresistible. But more importantly, I found a sense of belonging I'd never experienced. The farmhouse became more than a residence. It became a sacred trust, a guardianship that connected me to something far larger than my individual existence. The well singer continues to perform each night, and I continue to join her in our concerts under the stars. New patterns emerge in our collaborations, new melodies that seem to predict seasonal changes or respond to the needs of the land. Through our music, I've learned to listen to the world in ways that go far beyond ordinary hearing. last week. I met the young couple who've been looking at the property that borders mine to the east. They're musicians. She's a violinist with the regional symphony, and he's a composer working on a piece inspired by rural folklore. When they mentioned that they'd been hearing beautiful singing at night, but couldn't locate its source, I knew that the well singer had found her next collaborators. I invited them for dinner this weekend. We'll eat on the back porch, where the acoustics are perfect for hearing the evening concert. And when the singing begins, I'll add my voice to hers, creating harmonies that will help them understand they've found something far more precious than just a peaceful place to live. The well holds many songs, and she's always ready to teach them to the right listeners. In a world growing increasingly disconnected from the natural mysteries that sustain us, we are the fortunate few chosen to remember what the earth itself sounds like when it sings. And once you've heard that music, once you've learned to sing along, you can never really leave. Not because you're trapped, but because you've finally found the place where you've always belonged. The voice that's been calling to you your whole life without you realizing you were listening for it. The song continues night after night, weaving us all into its eternal melody.